Chapter 12. Cachalots and whales. The Nautilus reversed course, heading south once again on the nights of March 13th and 14th. I had a hunch that upon reaching Cape Horn, we would turn westward to navigate the Pacific, completing our circumnavigation, but no such luck. We continued our southward trajectory, delving deeper into the polar regions. It was madness. Captain Nemo's reckless audacity was beginning to validate Ned Land's anxieties. The Canadian hadn't mentioned his escape plans for a while. He was withdrawn, almost mute. It was clear the prolonged confinement was taking a toll, and a silent fury simmered beneath the surface. Every encounter with the captain ignited a spark of repressed rage in his eyes. I was growing increasingly apprehensive that his inherent impulsiveness would lead to something drastic. On March 14th, Conseil and Ned came to my quarters. I inquired about the reason for their visit. "A simple question, sir," Ned replied. "Go ahead, Ned. How many men do you estimate are aboard the Nautilus?" "I can't say for certain, my friend. I wouldn't imagine its operation necessitates a large crew. Certainly, given the present circumstances, 10 men should suffice, at most. Then why should there be more?" "Why?" I countered, meeting Ned Land's gaze. His intentions were transparent. "Because," I continued, "if my assumptions are accurate, and I've correctly grasped the captain's situation, the Nautilus isn't just a vessel. It's a sanctuary for those who, like its commander, have severed all ties with the terrestrial world." "Perhaps," Conseil chimed in, "but regardless, the Nautilus has a finite capacity. Couldn't you, sir, estimate the maximum number of occupants?" "How, Conseil?" "By calculation. Given the vessel's size, which you're familiar with, and consequently the volume of air it holds, also knowing the amount of air each person consumes per breath, and then factoring in the Nautilus's need to surface every 24 hours. Before Conseil could finish, I saw where he was heading. "I understand," I said. "But that calculation, although straightforward, can only yield a very approximate result." "That's irrelevant," Ned Land interjected impatiently. "All right then," I conceded. "Here's the breakdown. In 1 hour, a person uses the oxygen in roughly 90 litres of air. In 24 hours, that translates to 2,160 litres. We need to determine how many times 2,160 litres of air fit within the Nautilus." "Precisely," Conseil affirmed. "So," I carried on, "the Nautilus, being 1,500 tons, and 1 ton holding about 900 litres, contains 1,350,000 litres of air. Dividing this by 2,160 gives us a quotient of 625. This implies, strictly speaking, that the air in the Nautilus could sustain 625 people for 24 hours. 625, Ned echoed. "But bear in mind that all of us, passengers, crew, and officers combined, wouldn't constitute even a tenth of that figure." "Still excessive for 3 men, Conseil murmured. Ned shook his head, ran a hand across his brow, and departed without a word. "May I make an observation, sir?" Conseil inquired. "Poor Ned yearns for the unattainable. He's haunted by his past life. He pines for everything we're denied. His mind is filled with old memories. We must try to understand him. What purpose does he serve here? None. He isn't scholarly like you, sir. Nor does he share our fascination with the ocean's wonders. He would risk anything for another drink in a tavern back home." The monotony of life on board was undoubtedly unbearable for the Canadian, accustomed to freedom and an active life. Events capable of stirring his spirit were few and far between. But that day, something did occur that rekindled the harpooner's glory days. Around 11 in the morning, while surfaced, the Nautilus encountered a pod of whales, not a surprising sight, considering these hunted creatures often sought refuge in these high latitudes. We were on the platform, the sea tranquil. The October weather in these regions was gifting us some splendid autumnal days. It was the Canadian. He couldn't be wrong. who spotted a whale on the eastern horizon. Focusing, one could see its dark back rising and falling with the waves, about 5 miles from the Nautilus. "Ah!" Ned exclaimed. "If I were on a whaler now, such a sight would thrill me. That's a big one. Look at the powerful plumes of air and vapor from its blowholes. Damn it, why am I confined to this steel prison?" "What, Ned?" I said. "You haven't abandoned your old fishing dreams? Can a whaler ever forget his trade, sir? Can he ever tire of the excitement of the chase? You've never fished in these waters, Ned?" "Never, sir. Only in the northern seas, both in the Bering Strait and Davis Strait." "Then the southern whale is unfamiliar to you. You've hunted the Greenland whale, which wouldn't dare venture through the warm equatorial waters. Whales are localized by species to specific seas they never leave. If one traveled from the Bering Strait to Davis Strait, it's because there's a passage between them, either on the American or Asiatic side. In that case, having never fished these seas, I don't know the type of whale inhabiting them." "I've told you, Ned." "All the more reason to get acquainted," Conseil added. "Look, look," the Canadian shouted. "They're getting closer, taunting me, knowing I can't reach them." Ned stomped his feet. His hand shook as he gripped an imaginary harpoon. "Are these cetaceans as large as those in the northern seas?" he inquired. "Almost, Ned, because I've seen massive whales, sir, measuring 100 feet. I've even heard tales of those in the Aleutian Islands reaching 150 feet. That seems exaggerated. These are likely rorquals with dorsal fins. Like sperm whales, they're generally smaller than the Greenland whale." "Ah!" the Canadian cried, his eyes glued to the ocean. "They're closing in, sharing the same waters as the Nautilus." Then, returning to the conversation, he said, "You mentioned the sperm whale as a small creature. I've heard of colossal ones. They're intelligent beings. Some say they camouflage themselves with seaweed, appearing like islands. People camp on them, light fires, and build houses," Conseil quipped. "Yes, wise guy," Ned retorted. "And one fine day, the creature dives, taking everyone with it to the ocean floor." "Sounds like a Sinbad the Sailor tale," I replied with a laugh. "Ah," Ned suddenly exclaimed. "It's not one whale. There are 10, 20, a whole pod, and I'm helpless, bound hand and foot." "But friend Ned," Conseil suggested, "why not ask Captain Nemo's permission to hunt them?" Before Conseil could finish, Ned had vanished through the hatch to find the captain. They reappeared on the platform moments later. Captain Nemo observed the pod of cetaceans frolicking about a mile from the Nautilus. "Southern right whales," he remarked. "There goes the fortune of an entire whaling fleet." "Well, sir," the Canadian inquired, "can't I chase them, even just to relive my harpooning days?" "To what end?" Captain Nemo countered. "Merely to destroy? We have no need for whale oil on board." "But sir," the Canadian persisted, "in the Red Sea, you allowed us to pursue the dugong. That was to provide fresh meat for my crew. Here, it would be killing for sport. I understand that's a privilege reserved for man, but I don't condone such murderous amusement. By hunting the southern right whale, a harmless creature like the Greenland whale, your traders commit a reprehensible act, Master Land. They've already decimated Baffin Bay, wiping out a species of beneficial animals. Leave the poor cetaceans in peace. They have enough natural predators, sperm whales, swordfish, and sawfish, without your interference." The captain was right. The ruthless and thoughtless greed of these fishermen would one day lead to the extinction of the last whale in the ocean. Ned Land whistled Yankee Doodle through his teeth, shoved his hands in his pockets, and turned his back on us. But Captain Nemo continued to watch the whales, and addressing me said, "I was correct in stating that whales have sufficient natural enemies, even excluding man. These ones will soon have their hands full. Do you see those dark moving specks about 8 miles to leeward, Monsieur Aronnax?" "Yes, Captain," I replied. "Those are sperm whales, fearsome creatures. I've encountered pods of 200 or 300. They're vicious, destructive animals. Eradicating them would be justified." The Canadian spun around at those final words. "Well, Captain," he said, "there's still time, for the sake of the whales. There's no need to risk ourselves, Professor. The Nautilus will scatter them. It's equipped with a steel spur as effective as Master Land's harpoon, I'd wager." Ned didn't even bother with a shrug. "Attack whales with a spur? Preposterous." "Just wait, Miss Aronnax," Captain Nemo said. "We'll show you something extraordinary. We have no sympathy for these ferocious beasts. They're nothing but mouths and teeth. Mouths and teeth indeed. No description could be more fitting for the macrocephalic sperm whale, sometimes exceeding 75 feet in length. Its massive head constitutes a third of its body. Better armed than the baleen whale, it possesses 25 large tusks, each about 8 inches long, cylindrical and conical at the tip, weighing 2 pounds apiece. It's in the upper part of this colossal head, within vast cavities separated by cartilage, that one finds 600 to 800 pounds of the prized spermaceti oil. The sperm whale is an ungainly creature, more tadpole than fish, as Fredol described it. Its left side is, to put it mildly, underdeveloped, leaving it with only its right eye for vision. But the menacing pod was drawing near. They had spotted the right whales and were gearing up for an attack. It was clear the sperm whales would emerge victorious, not only due to their superior offensive capabilities, but also their ability to remain submerged for longer durations. There was barely enough time to intervene on behalf of the right whales. The Nautilus descended beneath the waves. Conseil, Ned Land, and I took our positions by the saloon window, while Captain Nemo joined the pilot in his chamber to operate his destructive machinery. Soon, I felt the propeller's rhythm accelerate, our speed surging. The clash between the sperm whales and the right whales had already commenced when the Nautilus arrived. Initially, they showed no fear at the sight of this new entrant into the fray, but they soon had to reckon with its blows. What a spectacle! The Nautilus was a fearsome harpoon, wielded by its captain. It rammed into the fleshy masses, cleaving them in two, leaving behind quivering halves. It was impervious to the powerful blows from their tails against its sides, or the impact it inflicted itself. One sperm whale dispatched, it charged at the next, maneuvering to ensure a hit, darting back and forth, responding to the helm, plunging when the cetacean dove into the depths, rising with it to the surface, striking from the front or side, slicing and tearing at will and at any speed, impaling with its deadly spur. The carnage was immense. The noise on the surface was deafening. The sharp hisses and snorts of these enraged creatures filled the air. In these typically serene waters, their tails churned up monstrous waves. This relentless slaughter continued for an hour, the sperm whales unable to escape. Several times, groups of 10 or 12 attempted to crush the Nautilus with their combined weight. From the window, we could see their enormous, tusk-studded mouths and their menacing eyes. Ned Land was beside himself, cursing and shouting threats. We could feel them clinging to our vessel like hounds savaging a wild boar in a thicket. But the Nautilus, propelled by its screw, dragged them here and there, or to the ocean's upper reaches, indifferent to their immense weight or the tremendous strain on the ship. Finally, the mass of sperm whales dispersed, the waves subsided, and I sensed our ascent to the surface. The hatch opened, and we rushed onto the platform. The sea was littered with mangled carcasses. A massive explosion couldn't have dismembered and torn this fleshy mass with more force. We were adrift amidst colossal bodies, bluish on their backs and white underneath, covered in enormous lumps. Some terrified sperm whales were fleeing towards the horizon. The water was stained red for miles, and the Nautilus floated in a sea of blood. Captain Nemo joined us. "Well, Master Land?" he inquired. "Well, sir," the Canadian replied, his excitement somewhat tempered. "It's a horrifying sight, no doubt, but I'm not a butcher, I'm a hunter, and this is butchery. It's a massacre of destructive creatures," the captain countered, "and the Nautilus is not a butcher's knife." "I prefer my harpoon," Ned grumbled. "To each his own," the captain responded, fixing his gaze on Ned Land. I feared he might lash out, leading to dire consequences. But his anger was diverted by the sight of a right whale the Nautilus had just encountered. The creature hadn't entirely escaped the sperm whale's onslaught. I recognized it by its flat, entirely black head. Anatomically, it's distinguished from the white whale and the North Cape whale by its 7 cervical vertebrae and 2 additional ribs. The unfortunate creature lay on its side, riddled with bite marks, lifeless. From its mutilated fin still hung a calf it couldn't protect from the carnage. Its open mouth allowed water to flow in and out, creating a murmur like waves crashing on the shore. Captain Nemo steered close to the whale's corpse. 2 of his men climbed onto it, and to my surprise, they began extracting milk from its breasts, amounting to about 2 or 3 tons. The captain offered me a cup of the still warm milk. I couldn't help but express my reluctance, but he assured me it was delicious, indistinguishable from cow's milk. I tried it and had to agree. It was a valuable resource, providing a welcome change from our usual fare in the form of salted butter or cheese. From that day on, I observed with growing unease Ned Land's increasing resentment towards Captain Nemo, and I resolved to keep a close watch on the Canadian's actions. Chapter 13. The Iceberg. The Nautilus relentlessly pursued its southerly course, shadowing the 50th meridian at a considerable pace. Was the captain aiming for the South Pole? I doubted it. Every prior attempt to reach that point had been unsuccessful. Moreover, the season was far advanced. In the Antarctic, March 13th mirrored September 13th in the Northern Hemisphere, marking the onset of autumn. On March 14th, at 55 degrees latitude, we encountered floating ice, mere fragments, 20 to 25 feet in length, forming clusters over which the sea surged. The Nautilus remained surfaced. Ned Land, a veteran of Arctic fishing expeditions, was no stranger to icebergs, but Conseil and I beheld them with fresh eyes. A dazzling white streak stretched across the southern horizon. English whalers called this phenomenon ice blink. No matter how dense the cloud cover, it was always discernible. A herald of an ice pack or shelf. Soon, larger blocks appeared, their radiance shifting with the capricious fog. Some exhibited green veins, like long, winding trails of copper sulfate. Others resembled giant amethysts, sunlight filtering through their crystalline structures. A few mirrored the daylight on countless facets, while others, tinged with vivid calcareous hues, resembled a magnificent marble city. The further south we ventured, the more these floating islands multiplied and grew in size. By 60 degrees latitude, all navigable passages had vanished. But with meticulous searching, Captain Nemo soon uncovered a narrow opening, through which he daringly steered the Nautilus, knowing it would close behind us. Under his expert guidance, we navigated through the labyrinth of ice with remarkable precision that captivated Conseil. Icebergs towered like mountains, ice fields stretched into boundless plains, and drift ice and ice floes formed a chaotic jigsaw puzzle. The temperature plummeted. The thermometer, exposed to the air, registered 2 or 3 degrees below zero, but we were insulated by fur clothing, courtesy of the sea bears and seals. The Nautilus's interior, consistently warmed by its electric system, defied the harshest cold. Moreover, one only needed to descend a few yards beneath the waves to encounter a more tolerable temperature. 2 months prior, we would have enjoyed perpetual daylight at this latitude. But already, we were experiencing 3 or 4 hours of night, and soon, these circumpolar regions would be shrouded in 6 months of darkness. On March 15th, we found ourselves at the latitude of the New Shetland and South Orkney Islands. The captain recounted how these islands were once teeming with seal colonies, but English and American whalers, in their relentless pursuit of profit, had slaughtered them indiscriminately, leaving behind a desolate silence where life once flourished. Around 8 a.m. on March 16th, the Nautilus, adhering to the 55th meridian, crossed the Antarctic Circle. Ice encircled us, closing in the horizon. Yet Captain Nemo skillfully maneuvered from one opening to another, venturing further south. The sheer beauty of these uncharted territories left me speechless. The ice sculpted itself into the most astonishing formations. In one place, it mimicked an oriental city with countless mosques and minarets. In another, a fallen metropolis, seemingly toppled by some cataclysmic event. The oblique sunlight constantly transformed the scenery or veiled it in a hazy fog amid swirling snowstorms. The air reverberated with the sounds of cracking and collapsing icebergs, dramatically altering the landscape like a living diorama. Often, seeing no way forward, I assumed we were trapped, but instinct seemed to guide Captain Nemo, leading him to a new passage at the slightest hint. He was never wrong when he spotted thin trickles of blue water meandering through the ice fields. I had no doubt he had ventured into the heart of these Antarctic seas before. On March 16th, however, the ice fields completely obstructed our path. It wasn't the icebergs themselves, but vast expanses of ice fused together by the relentless cold. This barrier couldn't deter Captain Nemo. He charged at it with terrifying force. The Nautilus pierced the brittle mass like a wedge, splitting it with a deafening crack. It was like an ancient battering ram propelled by immense power. Ice fragments, hurled high into the air, rained down around us. The Nautilus carved its own channel through the frozen expanse. At times, carried away by its momentum, it rode atop the ice, crushing it under its weight. At other times, it burrowed beneath, cleaving the ice with its sheer upward force. Fierce gales and thick fogs assaulted us. Visibility was zero from one end of the platform to the other. The wind howled from all directions, and the snow piled up so densely that we had to hack at it with pickaxes. The temperature remained a constant 5 degrees below zero. Every exposed surface of the Nautilus was encased in ice. A traditional sailing vessel would have been hopelessly ensnared in these frozen canyons. Only a vessel like ours, without sails, powered by electricity, and requiring no coal, could brave such extreme latitudes. Finally, on March 18th, after numerous futile attempts, the Nautilus was undeniably trapped. It was no longer streams, packs, or even ice fields, but an endless, unyielding barricade of fused mountains. "An iceberg!" the Canadian exclaimed. I knew that to Ned Land, as to all previous navigators, this was an insurmountable obstacle. The sun briefly emerged at noon, allowing Captain Nemo to take an approximate reading, placing us at 51 degrees 30 longitude and 67 degrees 39 south latitude. We had advanced 1 degree further into this Antarctic wilderness. The liquid surface of the sea was nowhere to be seen. Beneath the Nautilus's prow lay a vast plain, cluttered with jumbled blocks of ice. Here and there, sharp peaks and slender needles jutted 200 feet into the air. Further on, a steep cliff, seemingly carved by an axe, loomed in shades of grey. Gigantic mirrors reflected a few stray sunbeams, half submerged in the fog. And over this desolate landscape, a profound silence reigned, broken only by the occasional flutter of petrel and puffin wings. Even sound seemed frozen. The Nautilus was forced to halt its daring journey amidst this icy expanse. Despite our efforts, despite the powerful tools employed to break the ice, we remained immobile. Usually, when progress is impossible, retreat remains an option. But here, retreat was as futile as advance. Every passage behind us had closed, and even a brief pause risked complete entrapment. And that's precisely what happened around 2 p.m. Fresh ice rapidly formed around the Nautilus, encasing it. I had to concede that Captain Nemo was more than reckless. I was on the platform at the time. The captain had been surveying our predicament for a while when he turned to me. "Well, sir, what are your thoughts on this?" "I think we're trapped, Captain." "So, Aronnax, you genuinely believe the Nautilus can't extricate itself?" "With difficulty, Captain. The season is too far gone to rely on the ice breaking up." "Ah, sir," Captain Nemo said with a hint of irony, "you're always the same. You see nothing but challenges and impediments. I assure you, not only can the Nautilus free itself, but it can go even further." "Further south?" I asked, looking at the captain. "Yes, sir. It will reach the pole." pole!" I exclaimed, unable to suppress my disbelief. "Yes," the captain replied coolly, "the Antarctic pole. That uncharted point from which all the world's meridians originate. You're well aware that I can do as I please with the Nautilus." Indeed, I was. I knew this man was bold, even to the point of recklessness, but to overcome the obstacles guarding the South Pole, making it even more inaccessible than the North, which itself had yet to be reached by the most intrepid explorers. Wasn't that a foolhardy endeavour? A scheme only a madman would conceive. It then occurred to me to ask Captain Nemo if he had ever reached this pole untouched by human foot. "No, sir," he answered, "but we shall discover it together. Where others have faltered, I will not. I've never taken the Nautilus this far into southern waters, but I reiterate, it will go further still." "I believe you, Captain," I said, a touch of sarcasm in my voice. "I believe you. Let's forge ahead. There are no barriers for us. Let's shatter this iceberg. Let's blast it to pieces. And if it resists, let's give the Nautilus wings to soar above it." "Above it, sir," Captain Nemo said calmly. "No, not above it, but beneath it." "Beneath it!" I exclaimed, a sudden realization of the captain's plan dawning on me. I understood. The Nautilus's extraordinary capabilities were about to serve us in this superhuman undertaking. "I see we're beginning to understand each other, sir," the captain said with a half smile. "You're starting to grasp the possibility, I should say the certainty, of this endeavour. What's impossible for an ordinary vessel is effortless for the Nautilus. If a continent blocks the pole, we'll stop at the continent. But if, on the contrary, the pole is surrounded by open sea, we'll reach the pole itself." "Certainly," I said, swept up in the captain's logic. "If the sea's surface is frozen, the depths remain unfrozen, thanks to the providential law that places the maximum density of ocean water slightly above its freezing point. And if I'm not mistaken, the portion of this iceberg visible above water is roughly 1/4 of its total mass." "Precisely, sir. For every foot of iceberg above the sea, there are 3 below. If these ice mountains aren't taller than 300 feet above the surface, they're no more than 900 feet below." "And what are 900 feet to the Nautilus?" "Nothing, sir. It could even seek out the uniform temperature of seawater at greater depths and withstand the 30 or 40 degrees of surface cold with ease." "Exactly, sir, exactly," I replied, growing animated. "The only challenge," Captain Nemo continued, "is remaining submerged for several days without replenishing our air supply." "Is that all?" "The Nautilus has ample reservoirs. We can fill them, and they'll provide us with all the oxygen we need." "Well considered, Monsieur Aronnax," the captain replied, smiling. "But I wouldn't want you to accuse me of recklessness, so I'll present all my objections first. Do you have any more?" "Just one. It's possible that if the sea exists at the South Pole, it might be ice-covered. Consequently, we wouldn't be able to surface." "But Captain," I countered, "have you forgotten that the Nautilus is equipped with a powerful spur? Couldn't we use it to break through the ice fields?" "Ah, sir, you're brimming with ideas today. Besides, Captain," I added enthusiastically, "why wouldn't we find open water at the South Pole, just as at the North? The Earth's frozen poles don't perfectly align in either the southern or northern hemispheres. Until proven otherwise, we can assume either a continent or an ice-free ocean exists at these 2 points on the globe." "I concur, Monsieur Aronnax," Captain Nemo replied. "I merely wanted you to realize that after raising so many objections to my plan, you're now overwhelming me with arguments in its favor." Preparations for this audacious venture commenced. The Nautilus's powerful pumps began forcing air into the reservoirs, storing it at high pressure. Around 4 p.m, Captain Nemo announced the sealing of the platform hatches. I took one last glance at the massive iceberg we were about to traverse. The weather was clear, the air crisp, the cold intense at 12 degrees below zero. But with the wind subsiding, the temperature was bearable. About 10 men ascended the Nautilus's hull, armed with pickaxes to break the ice encasing the vessel. We were soon freed. The operation was swift, as the new ice was still thin. We all returned below. The usual tanks were filled with the freshly liberated water, and the Nautilus began its descent. Conseil and I settled into the saloon. Through the open window, we could observe the lower layers of the Southern Ocean. The thermometer rose, the compass needle danced on the dial, at around 900 feet, as Captain Nemo had predicted. We were gliding beneath the uneven underside of the iceberg, but the Nautilus continued its descent, reaching a depth of 400 fathoms. The water temperature, 12 degrees at the surface, was now only 10. We had gained 2. Needless to say, the Nautilus's internal temperature was significantly elevated by its heating system. Every maneuver was executed with astonishing precision. "We'll make it through, sir, wouldn't you say?" Conseil remarked. "I believe we shall," I replied with unwavering confidence. In this open water, the Nautilus charted a direct course towards the pole, maintaining the 52nd meridian. From 67 degrees 30 out to 90 degrees, 22.5 degrees of latitude remained, approximately 500 leagues. The Nautilus maintained an average speed of 26 miles per hour, the pace of an express train. At this rate, we would reach the pole in 40 hours. For part of the night, the novelty of the situation kept us glued to the window. The electric lights illuminated the sea, but it was devoid of life. Fish didn't inhabit these confined waters. They merely used them as a passage between the Antarctic Ocean and the open polar sea. Our speed was exhilarating, the vibration of the long steel hull palpable. Around 2 a.m., I managed a few hours of rest, and Conseil followed suit. Crossing the ship, I didn't encounter Captain Nemo. I assumed he was at the helm. The next morning, March 19th, I resumed my position in the saloon. The electric log indicated a decrease in the Nautilus's speed. We were ascending, but cautiously, emptying the ballast tanks at a measured pace. My heart pounded. Were we about to surface and breathe the open polar air? No. A jolt informed me that the Nautilus had collided with the iceberg's underside, still significantly thick, judging by the muffled sound. We had indeed struck, to use a nautical term, but in the opposite direction, and at a depth of 1,000 feet. This implied 3,000 feet of ice above us, with 1,000 feet protruding above the waterline. The iceberg was thicker here than at its edges, not a comforting thought. Several times that day, the Nautilus attempted to ascend again, each time hitting the icy ceiling above. Sometimes we encountered only 900 yards of ice, with 200 above the surface. It was twice the height it had been when we initially submerged. I meticulously recorded the varying depths, creating a submarine profile of the ice formation as it unfolded beneath the water. That night, our situation remained unchanged. Still, 400 to 500 yards of ice separated us from the surface. It was gradually thinning, but what a formidable barrier still lay between us and the open ocean. It was now 8 a.m. As per the Nautilus's routine, the air should have been refreshed 4 hours ago, but I wasn't suffering unduly, even though Captain Nemo hadn't yet tapped into his oxygen reserves. My sleep that night was fitful. Hope and fear wrestled within me. I rose several times. The Nautilus's probing continued. Around 3 a.m., I noted that the iceberg's underside was only about 50 feet deep. 150 feet now separated us from the water's surface. The iceberg was gradually transforming into an ice field, the mountain into a plain. My eyes remained fixed on the pressure gauge. We were still ascending diagonally towards the surface that shimmered under the electric lights. The iceberg stretched above and below into ever-lengthening slopes, thinning mile by mile. Finally, at 6 a.m. on that unforgettable day, March 19th, the saloon door opened and Captain Nemo appeared. "The sea is open," was all he said. Chapter 14, The South Pole. I rushed onto the platform. There it was, the open sea, dotted with scattered ice fragments and drifting icebergs, a vast expanse of water. A multitude of birds filled the sky, and countless fish teemed beneath the waves, their colours ranging from deep blue to olive green, depending on the seabed below. The thermometer read 3 degrees Celsius above zero. Felt like springtime compared to our confinement behind the iceberg, its massive form now a distant silhouette on the northern horizon. "Are we at the pole?" I asked the captain, my heart pounding. "I'm not certain," he replied. "I'll take our bearings at noon." "But will the sun even be visible through this fog?" I questioned, glancing at the overcast sky. "Even the slightest glimpse will suffice," the captain assured me. Approximately 10 miles south, a lone island rose to a height of about 317 feet. We cautiously approached, mindful of potential underwater obstacles. An hour later, we reached it. 2 hours after that, we had circumnavigated it. It measured 4 or 5 miles in circumference. A narrow channel separated it from a substantial landmass, possibly a continent, as its boundaries were beyond our sight. The existence of this land seemed to support Maury's theory. The ingenious American had observed that between the South Pole and the 60th parallel, the sea was covered in massive ice floes, a phenomenon absent in the North Atlantic. He concluded that the Antarctic Circle must encompass considerable continents, as icebergs couldn't form in open water, only along coastlines. According to his calculations, the ice encircling the South Pole formed a colossal cap, at least 2,500 miles in circumference. The Nautilus, wary of running aground, had stopped about 3 cables' length from a shore dominated by a magnificent cluster of rocks. The captain, 2 crew members carrying instruments, Conseil, and I boarded a small boat. It was 10 a.m. Ned Land was nowhere to be seen. The Canadian likely didn't want to acknowledge the reality of the South Pole. A few oar strokes brought us to the sandy beach, where we disembarked. Conseil was about to leap onto the land when I held him back. "Captain," I addressed Nemo, "the honor of first setting foot on this land belongs to you." "Yes, sir," the captain replied. "And if I don't hesitate to tread on this South Pole, it's because, until now, no human has left a mark here." With that, he lightly stepped onto the sand. His heart swelled with emotion. He ascended a rock, leading to a small promontory, and there, arms crossed, silent and unmoving, he seemed to claim these southern territories with an intense gaze. After 5 minutes of this reverie, he turned to us. "Whenever you're ready, sir." I followed Conseil ashore, leaving the 2 men in the boat. For a considerable distance, the ground consisted of reddish sandstone, resembling crushed brick, interspersed with lava flows and pumice stones. Its volcanic origins were unmistakable. In some areas, wisps of smoke emitted a sulfurous odor, evidence that the subterranean fires hadn't lost their vigor. However, even after climbing a high elevation, I couldn't spot any volcano within a radius of several miles. We knew that in these Antarctic lands, James Ross had discovered 2 active volcanoes, Erebus and Terra, on the 167th meridian, at latitude 77 degrees 32. The vegetation on this barren continent seemed sparse. Lichens clung to the black rocks. Microscopic plants, rudimentary diatoms, a type of cell enclosed between 2 quartz shells, were scattered about. Long strands of purple and scarlet seaweed, buoyed by tiny air bladders, washed ashore by the waves. This constituted the meager flora of this region. The shore was littered with mollusks, small mussels, and limpets. I also observed countless northern cleos, about 1.25 inches long, which a whale could easily devour in a single gulp, and delicate sea butterflies fluttering near the water's edge. On the higher ground, some coral formations were visible, the kind that, according to James Ross, thrived in the Antarctic seas at depths exceeding 1,000 yards. There were also small kingfishers and starfish dotting the landscape, but the air was where life truly flourished. Thousands of birds of all kinds fluttered and soared, their cries deafening. Others congregated on the rocks, watching us pass without fear, even approaching our feet with a curious familiarity. There were penguins, remarkably agile in the water, but clumsy on land. They gathered in large numbers, emitting raucous calls, a solemn assembly in demeanor, but boisterous in their vocalizations. Albatrosses glided overhead, their wingspans stretching at least 13 feet, earning them the nickname vultures of the ocean. Giant petrels and skuas, a type of small duck with black and white underbellies, also shared the sky. Then there was a whole array of petrels, some whitish with brown-edged wings, others blue, unique to the Antarctic seas. These latter ones were so oily, as I remarked to Conseil, that the inhabitants of the Faroe Islands could light them with just a wick. Just a little more, Conseil quipped, and they'd be perfect lamps. After that, we can't expect nature to have pre-fitted them with wicks. About half a mile further on, the ground was pockmarked with the nests of sheathbills, a sort of breeding colony from which numerous birds emerged. Captain Nemo had several hundred of them hunted. They let out a cry like a donkey's bray, were roughly the size of geese, slate-coloured on top and white underneath, with a yellow band around their necks. They offered no resistance, allowing themselves to be killed with stones. But the fog persisted, and by 11 a.m., the sun still hadn't shown itself. Its absence worried me. Without it, observations were impossible. How could we confirm we had reached the pole? When I rejoined Captain Nemo, I found him leaning against a rock, silently gazing at the sky. He appeared impatient and frustrated. But what could be done? Even this audacious and powerful man couldn't control the sun as he did the sea. Noon arrived, and as before, the sun remained hidden. It was a cruel twist of fate. We still lacked the necessary observations. If we couldn't obtain them tomorrow, we'd have to abandon any hope of doing so. It was, after all, March 20th. Tomorrow, the 21st, would be the equinox. The sun would vanish below the horizon for 6 months, ushering in the long polar night. Since the September equinox, it had risen from the northern horizon in elongated spirals until December 21st. At that point, the summer solstice in the northern regions, it had begun its descent, and tomorrow it would cast its final rays upon them. I shared my concerns and observations with Captain Nemo. "You're right, Miss Aronnax," he said. "If I can't measure the sun's altitude tomorrow, I won't be able to for 6 months. But precisely because chance has brought us to these seas on March 21st, my calculations will be straightforward, provided we can see the sun at noon." "Why is that, Captain?" "Because at the equinox, the sun traces such long arcs across the sky that accurately measuring its height above the horizon is challenging, and instruments can introduce significant errors." "What will you do then?" "I'll rely solely on my chronometer," Captain Nemo replied. "If tomorrow, March 21st, the sun's disk, accounting for refraction, is precisely bisected by the northern horizon, it will confirm that we're at the South Pole." "I see," I said. "But that's not mathematically precise, as the equinox doesn't necessarily begin at noon." "Likely so, sir, but the margin of error won't exceed 100 yards, and that's sufficient for our purposes. Until tomorrow, then." Captain Nemo returned to the Nautilus. Conseil and I remained ashore, exploring and studying until 5 p.m. Then I retired to bed, not without first, like the Indians, silently appealing to the celestial orb for its favor. The following day, March 21st, I was on the platform at 5 a.m. Captain Nemo was already there. "The weather is clearing slightly," he remarked. "I'm hopeful. After breakfast, we'll go ashore and select a location for our observations." With that settled, I went in search of Ned Land. I wanted him to join us, but the stubborn Canadian declined. His taciturnity and sullenness seemed to intensify with each passing day. Under the circumstances, I wasn't entirely displeased by his obstinacy. The shore was teeming with seals, and it was best not to tempt this impulsive fisherman. After breakfast, we headed ashore. The Nautilus had moved several miles further south during the night. It was a full league from the coast, above which a sharp peak, roughly 500 yards high, loomed. The boat carried Captain Nemo, 2 crew members, and the instruments, a chronometer, a telescope, and a barometer. During the crossing, I spotted numerous whales of the 3 species indigenous to the southern seas. The right whale, lacking a dorsal fin, the humpback whale, with its pleated chest and large whitish fins that, despite their name, didn't function as wings, and the fin whale, yellowish-brown in colour, the most energetic of all cetaceans. This powerful creature announces its presence from afar when it spouts towering columns of air and vapour that resemble swirling smoke. These various mammals were frolicking in groups in the calm waters, and it was evident that this Antarctic basin served as a sanctuary for cetaceans relentlessly pursued by hunters. I also observed large jellyfish drifting among the kelp. We landed at 9 AM. The sky was brightening, clouds scudded southwards, and the fog seemed to be lifting from the frigid water. Captain Nemo headed towards the peak, his intended observatory, no doubt. It was an arduous climb over jagged lava and pumice stones, the air often heavy with the sulphurous scent emanating from smoking fissures. For someone unaccustomed to traversing land, the captain scaled the steep slopes with unmatched agility, a feat that would have impressed any seasoned hunter. It took us 2 hours to reach the summit of this peak, composed partly of porphyry and partly of basalt. From this vantage point, we surveyed a vast ocean that, to the north, clearly delineated its boundary against the sky. Beneath us stretched fields of blinding whiteness. Overhead, a pale azure sky, devoid of fog. To the north, the sun resembled a fiery ball, already partially eclipsed by the horizon. Hundreds of liquid plumes erupted from the water's surface. In the distance, the Nautilus rested like a slumbering whale. Behind us, to the south and east, lay an immense expanse of land, a chaotic jumble of rocks and ice, its edges unseen. Upon reaching the summit, Captain Nemo meticulously recorded the barometric pressure, a crucial factor for his observations. At 11:45, the sun, visible only through refraction, appeared as a golden disk, casting its final rays upon this desolate continent and the seas no human had ever sailed. Captain Nemo, equipped with a special lens that corrected for refraction using a mirror, watched as the sun gradually sank below the horizon, tracing a long diagonal path. I clutched the chronometer, my heart raced. If the disappearance of the sun's lower half coincided with 12 o'clock on the chronometer, we were at the pole itself. 12! I shouted. The South Pole, Captain Nemo declared solemnly, handing me the lens, which revealed the sun's disk perfectly bisected by the horizon. I gazed at the last rays illuminating the peak, the shadows slowly creeping up its slopes. At that moment, Captain Nemo, his hand resting on my shoulder, proclaimed, "I, Captain Nemo, on this 21st day of March, 1868, have reached the South Pole at 90 degrees latitude, and I claim this portion of the globe, equal to 1/6 of the known continents." "In whose name, Captain?" "In my own, sir." With that, Captain Nemo unfurled a black flag emblazoned with a golden N. Then, turning towards the sun as its final rays kissed the sea's horizon, he exclaimed, "Farewell, sun. Vanish, radiant orb. Rest beneath this open sea, and let a 6-month night cast its shadows over my new dominion." Chapter 15. Accident or Incident. The next day, March 22nd. Preparations for departure commenced at 6 AM. The last vestiges of twilight surrendered to the encroaching night. The cold was intense, the constellations blazing with extraordinary brilliance. The magnificent Southern Cross, the polar bear of the Antarctic, dominated the zenith. The thermometer plunged to 12 degrees below zero, and the wind, when it picked up, was brutally biting. The open water was increasingly speckled with ice flakes. The sea appeared uniform in all directions. Numerous dark patches mottled the surface, signaling the formation of fresh ice. It was clear that the southern basin, frozen solid for 6 winter months, was utterly impassable. Where did the whales go during this time? They likely retreated beneath the icebergs, seeking more hospitable waters. As for the seals and walruses, adapted to harsh climates, they remained on these icy shores. These creatures instinctively carved breathing holes in the ice and kept them open. When the birds, driven away by the cold, migrated north, these marine mammals became the sole occupants of the polar continent. Meanwhile, the Nautilus's ballast tanks were filling, and the vessel slowly descended. At 1,000 feet, it leveled off. Its propeller churned the water, and we began our northward journey at 15 miles per hour. By nightfall, we were already navigating beneath the colossal bulk of the iceberg. At 3 a.m., a violent impact jolted me awake. I sat up in bed, listening in the darkness, then was thrown to the floor. The Nautilus, after striking something, had rebounded sharply. I fumbled my way along the wall and up the stairs to the saloon, illuminated by its luminous ceiling. Furniture was overturned. Thankfully, the windows were securely fastened and had held firm. The paintings on the starboard side, no longer vertical, clung precariously to the wallpaper, while those on the port side hung at least a foot away from the wall. The Nautilus listed heavily to starboard, completely motionless. I heard footsteps and a jumble of voices, but Captain Nemo was absent. As I was leaving the saloon, Ned Land and Conseil entered. "What's happened?" I asked immediately. "I was about to ask you the same, sir," Conseil replied. "Damn it," the Canadian exclaimed. "I know well enough. The Nautilus has hit something, and judging by the way she's tilted, I doubt she'll right herself like she did in the Torres Strait." "But," I inquired, "has she at least surfaced?" "We don't know," said Conseil. "That's easy to determine," I responded. I checked the pressure gauge. To my astonishment, it indicated a depth of over 180 fathoms. "What does this mean?" I exclaimed. "We need to find Captain Nemo," Conseil stated. "But where is he?" Ned Land questioned. "Follow me," I instructed my companions. We left the saloon. The library was empty. No one was at the central staircase or the crew's quarters. I figured Captain Nemo must be in the pilot's cabin. It was best to wait. We returned to the saloon. For 20 minutes we sat there, straining to hear any sound from within the Nautilus. Then, Captain Nemo entered. He seemed oblivious to our presence. His usually stoic face betrayed anxiety. He silently observed the compass, then the pressure gauge. Moving to the chart table, he placed his finger on a point representing the southern seas. I didn't want to interrupt him, but a few minutes later, when he turned towards me, I spoke, echoing his own words from the Torres Strait incident. "An incident, Captain?" "No, sir. An accident this time." "Serious?" "Potentially." "Is the danger imminent?" "No." "The Nautilus has run aground." "Yes." "And how did this happen?" "A whim of nature, not human error. There's been no operational mistake. But we can't prevent the laws of physics from taking effect. We may defy human laws, but we can't resist natural ones." Captain Nemo had chosen an odd moment for philosophical musings. His answer, on the whole, wasn't very illuminating. "May I inquire, sir, as to the cause of this accident?" "A massive block of ice, an entire mountain, has capsized," he explained. "When icebergs are eroded at their base by warmer currents or repeated impacts, their center of gravity shifts, causing them to flip. That's what's happened." One of these blocks, as it overturned, struck the Nautilus, then slid beneath its hull, lifting it with tremendous force and lodging it in shallower waters, where it now rests on its side. "But can't we refloat the Nautilus by emptying its ballast tanks, allowing it to regain its equilibrium?" "That's precisely what we're doing at this moment, sir. You can hear the pumps working. Observe the pressure gauge. It indicates that the Nautilus is rising, but the ice block is rising with it. Until something obstructs its ascent, our situation won't change. Indeed, the Nautilus remained tilted to starboard. It would likely right itself once the ice block stopped moving, but at this moment, who knew if we might be crushed between the two icy surfaces? I contemplated the potential consequences of our predicament. Captain Nemo's eyes never left the pressure gauge. Since the iceberg's collapse, the Nautilus had risen about 150 feet, but it still maintained the same angle from the vertical. Suddenly, a slight shift was felt within the hull. It was clearly righting itself, albeit slowly. Objects hanging in the saloon were visibly returning to their original positions. The walls were becoming more upright. No one spoke. With bated breath, we observed and felt the ship leveling. 10 minutes crawled by. "Finally, we're upright," I exclaimed. "Yes," Captain Nemo acknowledged, moving towards the saloon door. "But are we afloat?" I inquired. "Certainly," he replied, "since the ballast tanks aren't empty, and when they are, the Nautilus will naturally rise to the surface." We were in open water, but on both sides of the Nautilus, about 10 yards away, rose a dazzling wall of ice. Above and below, the same wall. Above, because the iceberg's underside loomed over us like a vast ceiling. Below, because the overturned block, gradually sliding, had come to rest against the sidewalls, which held it in place. The Nautilus was effectively trapped within a tunnel of ice, over 20 yards wide, filled with still water. Escaping was simple enough. We could move forward or backward, and then navigate freely beneath the iceberg. A few hundred yards deeper, the luminous ceiling had been switched off, yet the saloon was still bathed in intense light. It was the powerful reflection from the glass partition, violently thrown back by the lantern's beams. I can't adequately describe the effect of the voltaic rays on the massive, irregularly shaped ice blocks. Every angle, every ridge, every facet was illuminated differently, depending on the nature of the veins coursing through the ice. It was a dazzling spectacle of gemstones, particularly sapphires, their blue radiance intersecting with the green of emeralds. Here and there, opal hues of incredible softness blended with brilliant spots like fiery diamonds. Their brilliance almost too much for the eyes to bear. The lantern's power seemed magnified 100-fold, like a lamp through the lenses of a first-class lighthouse. "How beautiful! How breathtaking!" Conseil exclaimed. "Yes," I agreed. "It's a marvelous sight. Isn't it, Ned?" "Yes, damn it. Yes," Ned Land responded. "It's magnificent. I hate that I have to admit it. No one's ever witnessed anything like this, but the sight might cost us dearly. And if I'm being honest, I think we're seeing things here that God never intended for human eyes." Ned was right. It was almost too beautiful. Suddenly, a cry from Conseil made me turn. "What is it?" I asked. "Shield your eyes, sir. Don't look." With that, Conseil covered his eyes with his hands. "But what's wrong, my boy?" "I'm dazzled, blinded." My eyes instinctively darted towards the window, but I couldn't withstand the fiery glare that seemed to sear them. I understood what had happened. The Nautilus had accelerated to full speed. The serene glow of the ice walls instantly transformed into a strobe of lightning. The brilliance from these countless diamonds was overwhelming. It took a few moments for our vision to recover. Finally, we lowered our hands. "Honestly, I would never have believed it," Conseil remarked. It was 5 a.m. At that moment, a tremor shook the Nautilus's bow. I knew its spur had rammed into an ice block. It must have been a miscalculation, as navigating this submerged tunnel, littered with obstacles, was no easy task. I assumed Captain Nemo would either circumvent these hindrances or follow the tunnel's curves. In any case, the path ahead couldn't be completely blocked. But contrary to my expectations, the Nautilus began to reverse course. "We're going backward?" Conseil questioned. "Yes," I confirmed. "This end of the tunnel must be a dead end." "And then," I said, "the solution is simple. We need to turn back and exit through the southern opening. That's all." I tried to sound more confident than I truly felt, but the Nautilus's backward movement was accelerating, and with the propeller reversed, it carried us at a breakneck pace. "This will set us back," Ned observed. "What does it matter? A few hours more or less, as long as we eventually escape." "Yes," Ned Land echoed, "as long as we eventually escape." For a while, I paced between the saloon and the library. My companions remained silent. I soon settled onto a couch and picked up a book, my eyes skimming the pages without comprehension. 15 minutes later, Conseil approached me. "Is your reading material very engaging, sir?" he asked. "Very engaging," I replied automatically. "I should think so, sir. It's your own book you're reading." "My book?" And indeed, I was holding my own work on the great submarine depths. I hadn't even realized it. I closed the book and resumed my pacing. Ned and Conseil stood up to leave. "Stay here, my friends," I urged, stopping them. "Let's remain together until we're out of this predicament." "As you wish, sir," Conseil replied. Hours passed. I frequently glanced at the instruments on the wall. The pressure gauge indicated that the Nautilus maintained a consistent depth of over 300 yards. The compass still pointed south, and the log showed a speed of 20 miles per hour, quite fast in such a confined space. But Captain Nemo knew he couldn't afford to delay. Every minute felt like an eternity to us. At 8:25 a.m., a second impact struck, this time from behind. I paled. My companions were by my side. I grasped Conseil's hand. Our expressions conveyed our fears more eloquently than words. Just then, the captain entered the saloon. I approached him. "Our path is blocked to the south?" I asked. "Yes, sir. The iceberg has shifted, sealing all exits. So we're trapped?" "Yes." Chapter 16, Want of Air. An impenetrable wall of ice surrounded the Nautilus, both above and below. We were prisoners of the iceberg. I observed the captain. His expression had returned to its usual stoicism. "Gentlemen," he said calmly, "there are two ways to die in our current predicament." This enigmatic man had the demeanor of a mathematician lecturing his students. "First is to be crushed. The second is to suffocate. I won't even mention the possibility of starving, as the Nautilus's provisions will undoubtedly outlast us. So, let's assess our odds." "As for suffocation, Captain," I replied, "that's not an immediate concern, as our air tanks are full." "True, but they only hold enough air for 2 days. We've been submerged for 36 hours, and the Nautilus's atmosphere is already becoming stale. In 48 hours, our reserves will be depleted." "Well, Captain, can we be freed before then?" "We'll attempt it, at least, by breaching the wall encircling us." "On which side?" "Sound will guide us. I'm going to ground the Nautilus on the lower shelf, and my men will attack the iceberg at its thinnest point." Captain Nemo left. Soon, a hissing sound indicated that water was flooding the ballast tanks. The Nautilus gradually sank, settling on the ice at a depth of 350 yards, where the lower shelf lay submerged. "My friends," I said, "our situation is dire, but I have faith in your courage and determination." "Sir," the Canadian responded, "I'm prepared to do whatever it takes for the safety of us all." "Excellent, Ned," I said, extending my hand to him. "I'll add," he continued, "that I'm as adept with a pickaxe as I am with a harpoon. If I can be of service to the captain, he has only to ask. He won't refuse your assistance. Come, Ned." I led him to the room where the Nautilus crew was donning their diving suits. I informed the captain of Ned's offer, which he readily accepted. The Canadian suited up and was ready as quickly as his companions. Once Ned was prepared, I returned to the lounge, where the glass panels were open. Positioned next to Conseil, I examined the layers of ice encasing the Nautilus. Moments later, we saw a dozen crew members step onto the ice shelf. Ned Land, easily recognizable among them due to his height. Captain Nemo accompanied them. Before they started excavating, he took depth soundings to ensure they were working in the correct direction. Long-sounding lines were lowered into the sidewalls, but after 15 yards, they met the impenetrable barrier again. It was pointless to attack the ceiling-like surface, as the iceberg itself towered over 400 yards high. Captain Nemo then took soundings of the lower surface. There, only 10 yards of ice separated us from the water. Such was the thickness of the ice field. We needed to carve out a section equal to the Nautilus's waterline. Roughly 6,000 cubic yards had to be removed to create a hole through which we could descend to the ice field below. The work began immediately, carried out with relentless determination. Instead of digging around the Nautilus, which would have been more challenging, Captain Nemo ordered a massive trench to be excavated 8 yards from the port quarter. The men then simultaneously attacked several points along its circumference with their drills. Soon, pickaxes were vigorously hacking at the dense ice, dislodging large chunks. Due to a peculiar effect of specific gravity, these blocks, being lighter than water, floated upwards, accumulating at the tunnel's ceiling. which grew thicker as the base thinned. But that was of little concern, as long as the lower section continued to diminish. After 2 hours of strenuous labor, Ned Land returned, exhausted. He and his comrades were replaced by fresh workers, whom Conseil and I joined. The Nautilus's second officer oversaw our efforts. The water felt incredibly cold, but I quickly warmed up wielding the pickaxe. My movements were relatively unimpeded, despite the pressure of 30 atmospheres. When I returned to the Nautilus after 2 hours to eat and rest, I noticed a distinct difference between the pure air supplied by the Rouquayrol device and the Nautilus's atmosphere. Already heavy with carbon dioxide, the air hadn't been refreshed in 48 hours, and its life-sustaining properties were significantly diminished. Despite 12 hours of labor, we had only managed to remove a yard-thick layer of ice from the designated area, which amounted to about 600 cubic yards. At this rate, it would take 5 nights and 4 days to complete the task. 5 nights and 4 days. And we had only 2 days' worth of air remaining in the tanks. Not to mention, Ned pointed out, even if we escape this frozen hell, we'll still be trapped beneath the iceberg, cut off from the atmosphere. He was right. Who could predict the minimum time required for our rescue? We might suffocate before the Nautilus could resurface. Was it doomed to perish in this icy tomb, along with everyone on board? The situation was dire, but everyone faced the danger with resolve, each determined to fulfill their duty to the very end. As I anticipated, another square yard of ice was removed during the night, further deepening the immense cavity. But in the morning, as I traversed the slushy terrain in my diving suit, braving temperatures of 6 or 7 degrees below zero, I noticed the sidewalls gradually closing in. The water furthest from the trench, unaffected by the men's efforts, was showing signs of freezing. Faced with this new and immediate threat, what would become of our chances of survival? How could we prevent the solidification of this liquid medium, which would shatter the Nautilus's hull like glass? I didn't share this new danger with my companions. There was no point in undermining their resolve as they toiled to escape. But upon returning to the Nautilus, I informed Captain Nemo of this grave development. "I'm aware of it," he said in his usual calm tone, capable of dispelling even the most profound fears. "It's one more peril, but I see no way to avoid it. Our only hope is to outpace the solidification. We must stay ahead of it, that's all." That day, I worked tirelessly with my pickaxe for several hours. The labor kept my spirits up. Besides, working meant leaving the Nautilus and breathing the pure air from the tanks, a welcome change from the stale and contaminated atmosphere inside. By evening, the trench was another yard deeper. When I returned on board, I was nearly overcome by the carbon dioxide-laden air. If only we had the chemical means to eliminate this noxious gas. We had plenty of oxygen. The surrounding water contained a substantial amount, and by electrolyzing it with our powerful batteries, we could replenish the breathable air. I had pondered this, but it was futile, as the carbon dioxide produced by our respiration had permeated the entire vessel. To absorb it, we needed to fill jars with caustic potash and constantly shake them, but we lacked this substance on board, and nothing could replace it. That evening, Captain Nemo was forced to open the valves of his air tanks, releasing some fresh air into the Nautilus. Without this measure, we couldn't escape the feeling of suffocation. The next day, March 26th, I resumed my mining duties. Starting on the 5th yard, the side walls and the iceberg's underside were visibly thickening. It was evident they would converge before the Nautilus could break free. Despair momentarily gripped me, and my pickaxe nearly slipped from my grasp. What was the point of digging if I was destined to suffocate, crushed by the water turning to ice? A punishment even the most brutal savages wouldn't have devised. At that moment, Captain Nemo passed by. I touched his hand and gestured towards the walls of our icy prison. The port wall was now less than 4 yards from the Nautilus's hull. The captain understood and motioned for me to follow him. We returned to the ship. I removed my diving suit and accompanied him to the lounge. "Monsieur Aronnax," he said, "we must resort to desperate measures. or we'll be entombed in this solidifying water like concrete. Yes, but what can we do? Ah, if only the Nautilus were robust enough to endure this pressure without being crushed. And, I asked, not grasping his idea. Don't you see, he replied, that this freezing of the water could work in our favor? Don't you realize that as it solidifies, it could rupture this ice field imprisoning us, just as freezing water shatters the hardest stones? Don't you see that it could be our salvation instead of our doom? Yes, Captain, perhaps. But regardless of the Nautilus's resilience, it couldn't withstand this immense pressure. It would be flattened like a sheet of metal. I know, sir. That's why we can't rely on nature's assistance, but on our own efforts. We must halt this solidification. Not only are the sidewalls closing in, but there's less than 10 feet of water ahead of or behind the Nautilus. The ice is encroaching from all sides. How much longer will the air in the tanks last? The captain looked me in the eye. They'll be empty by tomorrow. A cold sweat washed over me. Should I have been surprised by his answer? On March 22nd, the Nautilus was in the open polar sea. We were at 26 degrees. For 5 days, we had been surviving on the ship's reserves. And what remained of the breathable air had to be prioritized for the workers. Even now, as I write this, the memory is so vivid that an involuntary terror grips me and my lungs feel starved for air. Meanwhile, Captain Nemo was lost in thought. An idea had clearly struck him, but he seemed hesitant to embrace it. Finally, he muttered, "Boiling water." "Boiling water," I echoed. "Yes, sir. We're confined in a relatively small space. Wouldn't jets of boiling water, continuously pumped out, raise the temperature in this area and prevent the water from freezing?" "Let's try it," I said resolutely. "Let's try it, Professor." The external temperature then was 7 degrees below zero. Captain Nemo led me to the galley, where the massive distilling machines that produced drinking water through evaporation were located. They filled these with water, and all the electric heat from the batteries was channeled through the coils submerged in the liquid. Within minutes, the water reached 100 degrees Celsius. It was then directed to the pumps, while fresh water replaced it in the machines. The heat generated by the coils was so intense that cold water, drawn from the sea and passed through the machines, emerged boiling into the pump. The injection commenced, and 3 hours later, the external thermometer read 6 degrees below zero. We had gained 1 degree. 2 hours later, it was down to 4 degrees. "We're going to make it," I said to the captain, having anxiously monitored the operation's progress. "I believe we'll avoid being crushed," he replied, "and we no longer need to fear suffocation." Throughout the night, the water temperature climbed to 1 degree below zero. The injections couldn't raise it any further. But since seawater freezes at around -2 degrees Celsius, I was at least reassured that solidification was no longer an immediate threat. The next day, March 27th, 6 yards of ice had been cleared, leaving only 12 feet remaining. We still had 48 hours of work ahead. The air inside the Nautilus couldn't be replenished, and this day would make it even worse. An oppressive weight bore down on me. Around 3 p.m., this sensation intensified. Yawns dislocated my jaw. My lungs struggled to inhale the scorching, increasingly rarefied air. A mental numbness took hold. I was weak, nearly unconscious. My brave Conseil, despite exhibiting the same symptoms and suffering similarly, never left my side. He held my hand, offered encouragement, and I heard him murmur, "Oh, if only I could stop breathing, to leave more air for my master." Tears welled up in my eyes, hearing him speak such words. If our situation was unbearable inside, imagine the eagerness with which we would don our diving suits to take our turn working outside. The sound of pickaxes echoed against the frozen ice. Our arms ached, the skin on our hands was torn. But what did these hardships matter? What did the wounds signify? We had vital air reaching our lungs. We were breathing. We were alive. Throughout this ordeal, no one extended their voluntary shift beyond the allotted time. Once their task was complete, they would pass the life-giving apparatus to their gasping companions. Captain Nemo led by example, enduring this harsh discipline first. When his time was up, he relinquished his gear to another and returned to the stale air on board, calm, resolute, and uncomplaining. That day, the usual work was accomplished with exceptional vigor. Only 2 yards remained to be cleared to the surface. Just 2 yards separated us from the open sea, but the air tanks were nearly empty. The little that remained had to be conserved for the workers, not a single breath for the Nautilus itself. When I returned on board, I was half suffocated. What a night! I can't adequately describe it. The next day, my breathing was labored. Dizziness compounded the pain in my head, making me feel like a drunkard. My companions exhibited the same symptoms. Some of the crew were wheezing. On that day, the 6th of our confinement, Captain Nemo, frustrated with the slow progress of the pickaxes, decided to try to shatter the remaining ice barrier separating us from the liquid expanse above. This man's composure and energy never wavered. He conquered his physical suffering through sheer willpower. Under his orders, the vessel was lightened, meaning it was raised from the icebed by altering its specific gravity. Once afloat, they towed it to position it directly above the immense trench dug at the waterline. Then, flooding his ballast tanks, he descended and sealed himself within the cavity. At that moment, the entire crew returned on board, and the double communication door was shut. The Nautilus now rested on the icebed, which was less than a yard thick and riddled with holes from the sounding lines. Tank valves were opened, and 100 cubic yards of water poured in, increasing the Nautilus's weight to 1,800 tons. We waited, we listened, our suffering momentarily forgotten in the surge of hope. Our survival hinged on this final gamble. Despite the buzzing in my head, I soon heard a rumbling beneath the Nautilus's hull. The ice cracked with an unusual sound, tearing paper, and the Nautilus sank. "We're free," Conseil whispered in my ear. I couldn't respond. I grabbed his hand and squeezed it tightly. Suddenly, propelled by its immense weight, the Nautilus plunged like a bullet through the water, as if falling through a vacuum. Then, all the electrical power was diverted to the pumps, which rapidly began expelling water from the tanks. Within minutes, our descent halted. Soon, the pressure gauge indicated an upward movement. The propeller, at full throttle, shook the iron hull to its core and pulled us northward. But if this submerged journey beneath the iceberg lasted another day before we reached the open sea, I wouldn't survive. Half collapsed on a couch in the library, I was suffocating. My face was flushed, my lips blue, my senses fading. I could neither see nor hear. All concept of time had vanished. My muscles refused to respond. I don't know how many hours passed in this state, but I was acutely aware of the approaching darkness. I felt death closing in. Then, abruptly, I regained consciousness. A few breaths of air filled my lungs. Had we surfaced? Were we free of the iceberg? No. Ned and Conseil, my 2 brave friends, were sacrificing themselves to save me. A few precious breaths of air remained at the bottom of one tank. Instead of using it themselves, they had saved it for me. While they were suffocating, they were giving me life, one breath at a time. I tried to push the device away, but they held my hands, and for a few moments I breathed freely. I glanced at the clock. It was 11 a.m. It must have been March 28th. The Nautilus was hurtling forward at a terrifying 40 miles per hour, literally tearing through the water. Where was Captain Nemo? Had he perished? Were his companions dead with him? At that moment, the pressure gauge indicated we were less than 20 feet from the surface. A mere sheet of ice separated us from the atmosphere. Could we break through? Perhaps. In any case, the Nautilus was about to attempt it. I sensed it tilting, the stern lowering and the bow rising. The intake of water had destabilized its equilibrium. Then, driven by its powerful propeller, it attacked the ice field from below like a colossal battering ram. It smashed into the ice, backing up, and then lunging forward repeatedly, the ice gradually yielding. Finally, with a sudden, forceful thrust, it burst through onto the ice field. which crumbled beneath its weight. The hatch was thrown open, practically ripped off, and fresh air flooded every corner of the Nautilus. Chapter 17, From Cape Horn to the Amazon. I have no recollection of how I made it onto the platform. Perhaps the Canadian carried me there. But I was breathing, inhaling the life-giving sea air. My two companions were practically intoxicated by the fresh oxygen. The other poor souls on board had been deprived of sustenance for so long that they couldn't safely consume even the simplest foods offered to them. We, on the other hand, had no such limitations. We could freely draw this air into our lungs, and it was the breeze alone, that filled us with such intense pleasure. "Ah!" Conseil exclaimed. "How wonderful this oxygen is. Master needn't worry about breathing it. There's plenty for everyone." Ned Land said nothing, but he opened his jaws wide enough to terrify a shark. Our strength quickly returned, and as I looked around, I realized we were alone on the platform. The Nautilus's foreign crew was content with the air circulating inside. None of them had ventured out to savor the open air. My first words were expressions of profound gratitude to my two companions. Ned and Conseil had sustained my life during the final hours of that agonizing ordeal. All my thanks couldn't repay such unwavering loyalty. "My friends," I said, "we are bound together forever, and I'm deeply indebted to you." "An indebtedness I intend to exploit," the Canadian declared. "What do you mean?" Conseil asked. "I mean that I'll take you with me when I leave this infernal Nautilus." "Well," Conseil said, "after all that, are we heading in the right direction?" "Yes," I replied, "because we're following the sun's path, and here the sun is in the north." "No doubt," Ned Land agreed, "but it remains to be seen whether he'll steer us into the Pacific or the Atlantic, that is, into populated or deserted waters." I couldn't answer that question, and I feared Captain Nemo would prefer to take us to the vast ocean that bordered both Asia and America. That would complete his circumnavigation of the underwater world, returning him to waters where the Nautilus could roam freely. We needed to clarify this crucial point soon. The Nautilus sped along. We quickly crossed the Antarctic Circle and set a course for Cape Horn. By 7 p.m. on March 31st, we were off the tip of South America. Our past sufferings faded into distant memory. The ordeal of our icy entrapment was erased from our minds. We focused only on the future. Captain Nemo was absent from both the lounge and the platform. The point marked daily on the map by the lieutenant revealed the Nautilus's precise course. That evening, to my great relief, it was evident we were returning north via the Atlantic. The following day, April 1st, the Nautilus surfaced a few minutes before noon, and we spotted land to the west. It was Tierra del Fuego, so named by early explorers due to the numerous smoke plumes rising from the natives' huts. The coast appeared low-lying, but in the distance, I could see towering mountains. I even thought I glimpsed Mount Sarmiento, its peak soaring 6,300 feet above sea level. Its sharp summit, shrouded in mist or clear, was a reliable indicator of impending rain or fair weather. At that moment, the peak stood out starkly against the sky. The Nautilus submerged again, approaching the coastline, now only a few miles away. Through the lounge windows, I observed long strands of seaweed, giant kelp, and other marine algae, abundant in the open polar sea, with their sleek, polished filaments. Some measured nearly 300 yards long, true cables, thicker than a thumb. Their remarkable strength made them suitable for ship ropes. Another seaweed, known as velper, with leaves 4 feet in length, anchored in coral formations, swayed on the seabed. It provided both shelter and sustenance for countless crustaceans and mollusks, crabs and squid. Seals and otters feasted there, indulging in a combination of fish and seaweed, much like the English. The Nautilus swiftly glided over this fertile and vibrant terrain. Towards evening, we neared the Falkland Islands, their rugged peaks recognizable the next day. The sea wasn't particularly deep. Our nets hauled in exquisite specimens of seaweed, particularly a type of kelp with roots harboring the most delicious mussels imaginable. Geese and ducks landed on the platform by the dozen, quickly destined for the ship's larder. Once the Falkland Islands vanished over the horizon, the Nautilus descended to a depth of 20 to 25 yards and followed the South American coast. Captain Nemo remained unseen. Until April 3rd, we stayed close to the Patagonian shores. Sometimes submerged, sometimes surfaced, the Nautilus passed the vast estuary of the Uruguay River. Its course was northward, tracing the lengthy contours of the South American coastline. We had now travelled 1,600 miles since embarking in the seas of Japan. Around 11 a.m, we crossed the Tropic of Capricorn at the 37th meridian and passed Cape Frio, jutting into the sea. To Ned Land's dismay, Captain Nemo seemed to dislike the proximity of Brazil's inhabited coasts. As we travelled at a dizzying speed, no fish, not even the swiftest bird, could keep up, and the natural wonders of these waters remained unseen. We maintained this speed for several days, and on the evening of April 9th, we reached the westernmost point of South America, Cape San Roque. But then the Nautilus veered off again, seeking the depths of a submarine valley nestled between this cape and Sierra Leone on the African coast. This valley branched out at the latitude of the Antilles and culminated in a massive 9,000-yard deep chasm. In this region, the ocean floor formed a sheer cliff, 3.5 miles high, extending as far as the Lesser Antilles. At the latitude of the Cape Verde Islands, another equally imposing wall enclosed the entire submerged continent of Atlantis. The floor of this immense valley was dotted with mountains, lending a picturesque quality to these underwater landscapes. I based this description on the manuscript charts in the Nautilus's library, clearly created by Captain Nemo himself, based on his personal explorations. For 2 days, we navigated these desolate depths using the Nautilus's inclined planes. Its long diagonal fins allowed it to reach any desired elevation, but on April 11th, it suddenly ascended, and land appeared at the mouth of the Amazon River, a vast estuary whose outflow was so significant that it diluted the seawater for several leagues. We crossed the equator. 20 miles to the west lay French Guiana, where we could easily have sought refuge. But a strong wind whipped up ferocious waves that no small boat could withstand. Ned Land undoubtedly realised this, as he said nothing about it. I too made no mention of his escape plans, unwilling to encourage an attempt that was bound to fail. I passed the time engrossed in fascinating studies. On April 11th and 12th, the Nautilus remained surfaced, and the nets brought in a remarkable haul of zoophytes, fish, and reptiles. Among the zoophytes snagged by the net chains were mainly stunning examples of fictalines, members of the Actiniaria family. These included the Fictalis protexta, unique to this part of the ocean, with its small cylindrical trunk adorned with vertical stripes and red dots, culminating in a magnificent crown of tentacles. The mollusks included some I had previously observed: turritellas, olive porphyras with intricate patterns and prominent red spots, peculiar pteroceras resembling petrified scorpions, translucent hyalaias, argonauts, squid, delicious to eat, and certain species of squid that ancient naturalists categorized as flying fish, primarily used as cod bait. I now had the opportunity to examine various fish species inhabiting these waters. Among the cartilaginous fish were Petromyzon marinus, or sea lampreys, a type of eel about 15 inches long, with a greenish head, violet fins, a greyish-blue back, a brown belly, and silvery sides speckled with bright dots, their pupils ringed with gold. These curious creatures, typically dwelling in fresh water, had been swept out to sea by the Amazon's current. There were also tuberculated sharks with elongated snouts and long, flexible tails equipped with a serrated spine. Small sharks, about a yard long, with grey and whitish skin, and several rows of backward curving teeth, commonly known as slipper sharks. And Vespertilios, a reddish isosceles triangle-shaped fish, about half a yard long, with pectoral fins connected by fleshy extensions that give them a bat-like appearance. However, their horn-like appendage near the nostrils had earned them the name sea unicorns. Finally, there were several species of triggerfish, including the queen triggerfish with its spots of brilliant gold, and the sargassum triggerfish, a vivid violet with iridescent hues like a pigeon's throat. I'll conclude this somewhat dry but meticulously accurate catalogue with a mention of a series of bony fish I observed. The Apteronotus albifrons, with its snow-white snout, a striking black body, and a very long, flowing, fleshy dorsal fin. Spiked Odontognathus, sardines 9 inches long, gleaming with a bright silver sheen. A type of mackerel with 2 anal fins, and the blackish Centronotus, typically fished with torches. Long fish, about 2 yards in length, with white, firm, fatty flesh that, when fresh, tastes like eel, and when dried, like smoked salmon. There were also wrasses, half red and scaled only at the base of their dorsal and anal fins. Chrysopteras, shimmering with gold and silver, intertwined with the brilliance of rubies and topaz. Golden-tailed sea breams, their flesh incredibly delicate, and their phosphorescent qualities betraying their presence in the water. Orange sea breams with elongated tongues, croakers with golden tail fins, dark porgies, anableps from Suriname, and so on. Despite this, etc., I must not omit a fish that Conseil will long remember, and for good reason. One of our nets had brought up a very flat type of ray, which, with its tail removed, formed a perfect disc and weighed about 20 ounces. It was white underneath and red on top, with large, round, dark blue spots encircled by black. Its incredibly smooth skin ended in a 2-lobed fin. Placed on the platform, it writhed, attempting to flip itself over with convulsive movements, its efforts so vigorous that one final twist nearly launched it back into the sea. But Conseil, not wanting to lose the fish, rushed towards it, and before I could stop him, grabbed it with both hands. In an instant he was on his back, legs in the air, half his body paralysed, shouting, "Oh master, master, help me!" It was the first time the poor lad had addressed me so informally. The Canadian and I lifted him and massaged his cramped arms until he regained his senses. The unfortunate Conseil had tangled with a highly dangerous electric ray, the Kumana. This peculiar creature, in a conductive medium like water, can shock fish from several yards away. Such is the power of its electric organ, whose 2 main surfaces measure no less than 27 square feet. The next day, April 12th, the Nautilus approached the Dutch coast, near the mouth of the Moroni River. There, we encountered several herds of sea cows, manatees which, like the dugong and the Steller's sea cow, belong to the Sirenia order. These magnificent creatures, peaceful and harmless, ranging from 18 to 21 feet in length, weigh at least 1,600 pounds. I explained to Ned Land and Conseil that nature had assigned a crucial role to these mammals. Like seals, they are meant to graze on underwater meadows, preventing the excessive growth of seaweed that clogs tropical rivers. And do you know, I added, what has happened since humans have nearly wiped out this valuable species? The decaying seaweed has contaminated the air, and the poisoned air leads to yellow fever, which ravages these beautiful lands. Enormous plant life proliferates in the warm seas, and the problem spreads relentlessly from the mouth of the Rio de la Plata to Florida. If we believe Toussaint, this current epidemic is nothing compared to what it would be if the seas were devoid of whales and seals. Then, teeming with octopuses, jellyfish and squid, they would become vast breeding grounds for disease, as their waves would lack those massive stomachs that God has tasked with purifying the surface of the seas. Chapter 18. The Pulps. For several days, the Nautilus steered clear of the American coast. Evidently, Captain Nemo was hesitant to risk navigating the tides of the Gulf of Mexico or the Caribbean Sea. On April 16th, we sighted Martinique and Guadeloupe from a distance of about 30 miles. I caught a fleeting glimpse of their majestic peaks. The Canadian, who had been counting on executing his escape plan in the Gulf, either by landing or hailing one of the numerous boats plying between the islands, was visibly disheartened. Escape would have been feasible if Ned Land could have commandeered the dinghy without the captain's knowledge, but in the open ocean, it was unthinkable. The Canadian, Conseil, and I had a lengthy discussion on the matter. We had been prisoners aboard the Nautilus for 6 months, travelling 17,000 leagues. As Ned Land put it, there was no reason to believe this would ever end. We couldn't rely on the Nautilus's captain for our freedom. We had to take matters into our own hands. Besides, lately, he had become more somber, withdrawn, and less sociable. He seemed to be avoiding me. Our encounters were infrequent. Previously, he had enjoyed explaining the underwater marvels to me, but now he left me to my studies and no longer joined us in the saloon. What had caused this change in him? And why? As for me, I refused to let my fascinating and groundbreaking research die with me. I now possessed the knowledge to write the definitive account of the sea, and I was determined to see this book published, sooner or later. The nearest land was the Bahamas archipelago. Its high underwater cliffs were draped in thick seaweed. It was around 11 a.m. when Ned Land alerted me to a sharp, stinging sensation, like an ant bite, caused by some large seaweed. "Well," I said, "these are ideal hiding places for giant squid, and I wouldn't be surprised to see some of those monsters here." "What?" Conseil exclaimed. "Real squid. Actual cephalopods." "No," I clarified. "Giant octopuses." "I'll never believe such creatures exist," Ned scoffed. "Well," Conseil said with the utmost seriousness, "I distinctly remember seeing a large ship dragged beneath the waves by a giant octopus's arm." "You saw that?" the Canadian asked. "Yes, Ned." "With your own eyes?" "With my own eyes." "And where, pray tell, did this occur?" "In Saint-Malo," Conseil replied. "In the harbour?" Ned inquired sarcastically. "No, in a church," Conseil answered. "In a church?" the Canadian cried out. "Yes, friend Ned, in a painting depicting the octopus in question." "Good one," Ned Land said, bursting into laughter. "He's right," I interjected. "I've heard of that painting, but the scene is based on a legend, and you know how reliable legends are when it comes to natural history. Besides, when it comes to monsters, imaginations tend to run wild. Not only are these octopuses believed to be capable of pulling ships under, but a certain Olaus Magnus even wrote about a mile-long octopus, more akin to an island than an animal. There's also a tale of the Bishop of Nidros building an altar on a massive rock. After Mass, the rock supposedly started moving and returned to the sea. The rock was an octopus. Another bishop, Pontoppidan, also spoke of an octopus large enough for an entire cavalry regiment to maneuver on. An ancient naturalist described monsters with mouths like chasms, too colossal to pass through the Strait of Gibraltar. "But how much truth is there to these stories?" Conseil asked. "None, my friends, at least anything that crosses the line from truth into myth or legend. Nevertheless, there must be some basis for these storytellers' imaginations. We can't deny the existence of large species of octopuses and squid, although they're smaller than cetaceans. Aristotle mentioned a squid measuring 5 cubits, or about 9 feet 2 inches. Our fishermen often encounter ones over 4 feet long. The museums of Trieste and Montpellier even house preserved octopus skeletons measuring 2 yards in length. Furthermore, according to some naturalist calculations, a 6-foot-long octopus would have tentacles 27 feet long. That's certainly enough to make a formidable creature. "Do people still fish for them these days?" Ned inquired. "If they don't fish for them, sailors at least see them. A friend of mine, Captain Paul Boss of Le Havre, often claimed to have encountered one of these colossal monsters in the Indian Ocean. But the most astonishing incident, one that leaves no doubt about the existence of these gigantic animals, happened a few years ago, in 1861. "What happened?" Ned Land pressed. "This is what occurred. In 1861, northeast of Tenerife, at almost the same latitude we're in now, the crew of the dispatch boat Elector spotted a monstrous squid swimming in the water. Captain Bouguer approached the creature and attacked it with harpoons and guns, but with little success, as the projectiles simply glanced off its soft flesh. After several failed attempts, the crew tried to lasso the mollusk's body. The noose slipped down to its tail fins and got stuck. They then attempted to haul it on board, but its weight was so immense that the rope's tension severed the tail from the body, and, minus this appendage, it vanished beneath the waves. Really? Is that a true story? An undeniable fact, my good Ned. They even proposed naming this squid Bouguer's cuttlefish. How long was it? The Canadian asked. Wasn't it about 6 yards long? Conseil interjected, peering out the window once more at the jagged contours of the cliff. Precisely, I confirmed. And its head, Conseil continued, wasn't it crowned with 8 tentacles that thrashed the water like a nest of snakes? Precisely. Didn't its eyes, located at the back of its head, appear abnormally large? Yes, Conseil. And wasn't its mouth shaped like a parrot's beak? Exactly, Conseil. Well then, with all due respect, Master, he replied calmly, if this isn't Bouguer's cuttlefish, it's at least one of its close relatives. I looked at Conseil. Ned Land rushed to the window. What a horrifying beast, he cried out. I looked too and couldn't suppress a shudder of revulsion. Before my eyes was a monstrous creature, truly worthy of being featured in tales of the supernatural. It was a gigantic squid measuring 8 yards in length. It swam laterally towards the Nautilus at incredible speed, its enormous, unblinking green eyes fixed on us, its 8 arms, or rather legs, attached to its head, the feature that gives these animals their name cephalopod, were twice as long as its body, and writhed like the hair of the Furies. We could see the 250 suckers lining the inner surface of its tentacles. The monster's mouth, a horned beak resembling a parrot's, opened and closed vertically. Its tongue, a horny appendage equipped with multiple rows of sharp teeth, protruded menacingly from this living pair of shears. What a bizarre creation of nature! A bird's beak on a mollusk. Its spindle-shaped body formed a fleshy mass that must have weighed between 4,000 and 5,000 pounds. Its colour, rapidly shifting with the creature's agitation, changed from a deathly grey to a reddish brown. What was provoking this mollusk? Undoubtedly the presence of the Nautilus, a being even more formidable than itself, and one its suckers or jaws couldn't grip. Still, what incredible creatures these cephalopods were. What vitality the Creator had bestowed upon them. What power in their movements. And they possessed 3 hearts. Chance had brought us face to face with this squid, and I didn't want to miss the opportunity to study this specimen closely. Overcoming the revulsion it instilled, I grabbed a pencil and started sketching. Perhaps this is the same one the Elector encountered, Conseil suggested. No, the Canadian retorted. This one's intact, the other had lost its tail. That's not conclusive, I countered. The arms and tails of these creatures regenerate. In 7 years, Bouguer's cuttlefish has surely had time to regrow its tail. By now, more squid had appeared at the port window. I counted 7. They formed a procession behind the Nautilus, and I could hear their beaks scraping against the iron hull. I continued my drawing. These monsters maintained their position in the water with such precision that they appeared motionless. Suddenly, the Nautilus lurched to a halt. A shockwave reverberated through its hull. Did we hit something? I asked. In any case, the Canadian replied, we're free because we're floating. The Nautilus was indeed afloat, but it wasn't moving. A minute passed. Captain Nemo, followed by his lieutenant, entered the lounge. I hadn't seen him in a while. He seemed grim. Without acknowledging or speaking to us, he went to the window, observed the squid, and exchanged a few words with his lieutenant. The lieutenant then left. Soon, the windows were closed, and the ceiling lights flickered on. I approached the captain. fascinating collection of squid, wouldn't you say? I remarked. Indeed, Mr. Naturalist, he replied. And we're about to engage them in battle, man against beast. I stared at him, convinced I had misheard. Man against beast? I repeated. Yes, sir. The propeller is jammed. I believe one of the squid's beaks is caught in the blades. That's what's preventing us from moving. What are you going to do? Surface and eliminate these pests. A challenging undertaking. Yes, indeed. Electric bullets are useless against their soft flesh. They don't offer enough resistance to detonate, but we'll attack them with hatchets. And the harpoon, sir, the Canadian interjected. If you'll accept my assistance. I'll gladly take it, Master Land. We'll follow you, I declared, and we trailed Captain Nemo towards the central staircase. There, about 10 men, armed with boarding hatchets, were poised for the attack. Conseil and I each grabbed a hatchet. Ned Land seized a harpoon. The Nautilus had now surfaced. One of the sailors, perched on the top rung of the ladder, began unscrewing the hatch bolts, but no sooner were the bolts loosened than the hatch was violently forced upward, clearly yanked by the suckers of a squid's arm. Immediately, one of these arms snaked down the opening like a serpent, with 20 others looming above. With a single swing of his hatchet, Captain Nemo severed this formidable tentacle, which slithered down the ladder. Just as we were scrambling to reach the platform, 2 more arms, thrashing through the air, descended upon the sailor standing in front of Captain Nemo, lifting him up with incredible force. Captain Nemo cried out and lunged forward. We rushed after him. What a scene! The unfortunate man, ensnared by the tentacle and its suckers, was suspended in mid-air, at the mercy of this colossal appendage. He gurgled, suffocating, and cried out, "Help! Help!" These words, spoken in French, shocked me. I had a fellow countryman on board, perhaps several. That heart-wrenching cry would haunt me forever. The poor man was doomed. Who could possibly free him from that powerful grip? But Captain Nemo had charged at the squid, severing one arm with a swift hatchet blow. His lieutenant fought fiercely against other monsters that were crawling onto the Nautilus's flanks. The crew battled with their axes. The Canadian, Conseil, and I plunged our weapons into the fleshy masses. A pungent odor of musk filled the air. It was horrifying. For a fleeting moment, I thought the man entangled with the squid might be torn free from its relentless suction. 7 of its 8 arms had been severed. Only one remained, flailing in the air, the victim dangling like a feather. But just as Captain Nemo and his lieutenant lunged at it, the creature unleashed a torrent of black ink. We were blinded. When the ink cloud dissipated, the squid had vanished, along with my unfortunate compatriot. 10 or 12 more squid now swarmed the platform and the Nautilus's sides. We tumbled headlong into this writhing nest of serpents, thrashing on the platform in a sea of blood and ink. It felt as if these slimy tentacles were multiplying like the heads of the Hydra. Ned Land's harpoon, with each thrust, pierced the unblinking eyes of the squid. But my brave companion was suddenly overwhelmed by the tentacles of a monster he couldn't evade. My heart pounded with fear and horror. The terrifying beak of a squid hovered over Ned Land. He was about to be ripped in two. I rushed to his aid, but Captain Nemo was ahead of me. His axe flashed between the 2 enormous jaws and miraculously saved. The Canadian, springing to his feet, plunged his harpoon deep into the squid's tri-chambered heart. I owed myself that revenge, the captain said to the Canadian. Ned nodded silently. The battle had raged for 15 minutes. The defeated and mutilated monsters finally retreated, disappearing beneath the waves. Captain Nemo, drenched in blood and nearly spent, gazed at the sea that had swallowed one of his companions, tears welling up in his eyes. Chapter 19, The Gulf Stream. None of us will ever forget the harrowing events of April 20th. I initially wrote about it in a state of intense emotion. Since then, I've revised the account and shared it with Conseil and the Canadian. They found it factually accurate, but lacking in its portrayal of the sheer terror we experienced. To truly capture such scenes, one would need the literary prowess of the most celebrated poets, someone like the author of The Toilers of the Sea, I mentioned that Captain Nemo wept as he gazed at the waves. His sorrow was profound. It was the second companion he had lost since we came aboard, and what a horrific death. That friend, crushed, suffocated, mangled by the monstrous arms of a squid, pulverized by its iron beak, wouldn't find rest with his comrades in their tranquil coral cemetery. During the struggle, it was the desperate cry of that unfortunate man that had pierced my heart. The poor Frenchman, forgetting his adopted language, had reverted to his native tongue in a final plea for help. Among the Nautilus crew, united in mind and spirit with the captain, shunning all contact with humanity like him, I had a fellow countryman. Was he the sole representative of France in this enigmatic group, evidently composed of individuals from various nations? It was one of those unanswerable questions that constantly plagued my thoughts. Captain Nemo retreated to his quarters, and I didn't see him for some time, but the ship itself, his vessel, his extension, reflected his melancholic and uncertain state. The Nautilus drifted aimlessly, like a lifeless body at the mercy of the currents. It seemed to wander without purpose. The captain couldn't tear himself away from the scene of the recent battle, from the sea that had claimed one of his men. 10 days passed in this manner. It wasn't until May 1st that the Nautilus resumed its northward course, after sighting the Bahamas at the entrance to the Bahama Channel. We were now riding the current of the mightiest river in the sea, with its own banks, its unique fish populations, and its distinct temperatures. The Gulf Stream. It truly is a river, flowing unimpeded through the heart of the Atlantic, its waters not mingling with the oceans. It's a saltwater river, saltier than the surrounding sea. Its average depth is 1,500 fathoms. Its average width, 10 miles. In some places, the current races at 2.5 miles per hour. The sheer volume of its water surpasses that of all the rivers on Earth combined. It was on this oceanic river that the Nautilus now sailed. I should add that at night, the Gulf Stream's phosphorescent waters rivaled the brilliance of our electric lights, especially during the frequent storms that threatened us. On May 8th, we were still traversing the waters off Cape Hatteras at the height of North Carolina. The Gulf Stream there spans 75 miles wide and 210 yards deep. The Nautilus continued its erratic course. All sense of direction seemed abandoned. I thought that under these circumstances, escape might be possible. The inhabited shores offered numerous potential havens. The sea was constantly crisscrossed by steamers traveling between New York or Boston and the Gulf of Mexico, and teeming day and night with small schooners navigating the various sections of the American coast. We could reasonably hope to be rescued. It was a favorable opportunity, despite the 30 miles separating the Nautilus from the US mainland. But one unfortunate factor thwarted the Canadians' plans. The weather was atrocious. We were approaching a region notorious for its frequent tempests, a breeding ground for waterspouts and cyclones spawned by the Gulf Stream itself. Venturing out in a small boat in such conditions was tantamount to suicide. Even Ned Land acknowledged this. He grew increasingly restless, consumed by a longing for home that only escape could alleviate. "Master," he said to me that day, "this has to stop. I need to be frank. This Nemo is leaving land behind and heading north. But I'm telling you, I've had enough of the South Pole, and I refuse to follow him to the north." "What can we do, Ned, since escape is impossible right now?" "We need to talk to the captain," he insisted. "You remained silent when we were in your home waters. I'll speak up now that we're in mine. When I think that the Nautilus will soon be near Nova Scotia, and that there, close to Newfoundland, lies a vast bay, and into that bay flows the St. Lawrence River, my river, the river by Quebec, my hometown. When I think of this, I'm filled with rage. It makes my hair stand on end. Sir, I'd rather jump into the sea. I can't stay here any longer. I'm suffocating." The Canadian was clearly reaching his breaking point. His spirited nature couldn't endure this prolonged confinement. His face grew more haggard each day, his mood increasingly sour. I understood his torment, as I too was gripped by homesickness. Nearly 7 months had passed without any news from the outside world. Captain Nemo's isolation, his changed demeanor, especially after the battle with the squid, his silence, all these factors made me see things in a new light. "Well, sir?" Ned prodded, seeing I didn't respond. "Well, Ned, do you want me to ask Captain Nemo about his plans for us?" "Yes, sir." "Even though he's already made them clear?" "Yes." "I want a definitive answer. Speak on my behalf, in my name alone, if you prefer." "But I rarely see him. He avoids me. All the more reason to seek him out." I went to my room, intending to proceed to Captain Nemo's. I couldn't let this opportunity to speak with him slip away. I knocked on his door. No answer. I knocked again, then tried the handle. The door opened, and I entered. The captain was there, hunched over his desk, engrossed in his work. He hadn't heard me. Determined not to leave without speaking, I approached him. He looked up abruptly, scowled, and said gruffly, "You here? What do you want?" "To speak with you, Captain." "But I'm busy, sir. I'm working." "I allow you the freedom to keep to yourself. Can't I be afforded the same?" This reception wasn't encouraging, but I was resolute. "Sir," I said coldly, "I need to speak with you about a matter that can't wait." "And what might that be, sir?" he retorted sarcastically. "Have you discovered something that's eluded me? Or has the sea revealed some new secrets?" We were talking at cross purposes, but before I could reply, he gestured towards an open manuscript on his desk and said in a more serious tone, "Here, Monsieur Aronnax, is a manuscript written in several languages. It contains the culmination of my studies of the sea, and, God willing, it won't perish with me. This manuscript, signed with my name and complete with my life story, will be sealed in a small, buoyant container. The last survivor among us on the Nautilus will cast this container into the sea, and it will go wherever the waves carry it. This man's name, his autobiography, his mystery might one day be unveiled." "Captain," I said, "I can only commend the sentiment behind your actions. The results of your research mustn't be lost. But your chosen method seems rather primitive. Who knows where the winds will take this container, or into whose hands it will fall? Couldn't you employ a different approach? Couldn't you, or one of your crew?" "Never, sir," he interrupted sharply. "But my companions and I are willing to safeguard this manuscript. And if you would grant us our freedom—" "Freedom!" the captain said, rising to his feet. "Yes, sir. That's the matter I wish to discuss with you. We've been on board for 7 months, and today, on behalf of my companions and myself, I ask you if you intend to keep us here indefinitely. Monsieur Aronnax, I'll give you the same answer I gave 7 months ago. Whoever boards the Nautilus never leaves it. You're imposing slavery on us. Call it what you will, but every slave has the right to reclaim their freedom. Who's denying you that right? Have I ever tried to bind you with an oath?" He stood there, arms crossed, staring at me. "Sir," I said, "revisiting this topic a second time is unpleasant for both of us, but since we've broached it, let's see it through. I repeat, this isn't just about me. Study is my solace, my escape, a passion that helps me forget everything else. Like you, I'm content to live in obscurity, clinging to the faint hope of one day leaving my work as a legacy for future generations. But Ned Land is different. Every man deserving of the title deserves some consideration. Have you considered that his love of freedom and hatred of captivity might breed thoughts of revenge in someone like the Canadian? That he might contemplate, plan, and attempt?" I was cut short. Captain Nemo stood up. "Whatever Ned Land contemplates, plans, or attempts is of no consequence to me. I didn't seek him out. I don't. Keep him on board for my own amusement. As for you, Monsieur Aronnax, you're one of those who can understand everything, even silence. I have nothing more to say to you. Let this be the first and last time you raise this subject, for I won't entertain it again." I left his quarters, disheartened. Our situation was critical. I relayed the conversation to my two companions. "We know now," Ned declared, "that we can expect nothing from this man. The Nautilus is approaching Long Island. We'll escape, regardless of the weather." But the sky grew increasingly ominous. Signs of a hurricane were brewing. The atmosphere turned hazy and white. On the horizon, delicate cirrus clouds gave way to towering cumulonimbus formations. Other low-lying clouds raced across the sky. The agitated sea swelled into massive waves. The birds vanished, except for the petrels, those harbingers of storms. The barometer dropped significantly, indicating a vast expanse of atmospheric moisture. The mixture in the storm glass separated under the influence of the electricity saturating the air. The tempest erupted on May 18th. Just as the Nautilus was positioned off Long Island, a few miles from the port of New York, I can vividly recall the clash of the elements, for instead of seeking refuge in the ocean depths, Captain Nemo, driven by some inexplicable impulse, chose to face it head-on at the surface. The wind initially blew from the southwest. During the squalls, Captain Nemo took his place on the platform, securing himself to avoid being swept overboard by the monstrous waves. I joined him, also fastening myself, my oar divided between the fury of the storm and this extraordinary man confronting it. The raging sea was lashed by massive clouds, heavy with water. The Nautilus, at times listing to one side, at times rearing up like a mast, rolled and pitched violently. Around 5 p.m., a torrential downpour began, offering no respite from the wind or the waves. The hurricane raged at nearly 40 leagues per hour. It was under these conditions that it toppled houses, shattered iron gates, and displaced 24-pound cannons. Yet, amidst the maelstrom, the Nautilus proved the words of a wise engineer. There is no well-built hull that cannot defy the sea. This wasn't an unyielding rock. It was a steel spindle, responsive and agile, without rigging or masts, fearlessly weathering the storm's fury. I watched the monstrous waves intently. They towered 15 feet high, stretched 150 to 175 yards long, and traveled at 30 feet per second. Their size and power intensified with the increasing depth of the water. Waves like these, in the Hebrides, had once displaced a mass weighing 8,400 pounds. They were the same kind that, in the December 23rd, 1864 tempest, had devastated the city of Yedo in Japan, and then crashed onto the American shores that very same day. The storm's intensity escalated as night fell. The barometer, as it had in 1860 during a cyclone on Reunion Island, plummeted by 7/10 by day's end. I saw a large ship on the horizon, struggling desperately. It was attempting to ride out the storm under half steam, fighting to stay afloat. It was likely one of the steamers on the New York to Liverpool or Le Havre route. It soon vanished into the darkness. By 10 p.m., the sky was ablaze. The atmosphere was streaked with vivid lightning. I couldn't bear its intensity, while the captain, observing it, seemed to envy the storm's spirit. A terrifying cacophony filled the air, a complex symphony of crashing waves, howling wind, and thunderclaps. The wind suddenly shifted, attacking from all points of the compass. The cyclone, originating in the east, returned after sweeping through the north, west, and south, reversing the typical pattern of circular storms in the southern hemisphere. Ah, that Gulf Stream. It truly earned its reputation as the king of tempests. It was responsible for these formidable cyclones, caused by the temperature differential between its air and its currents. A deluge of fire followed the rain. Raindrops turned into sharp needles. One would have thought Captain Nemo was seeking a death befitting his character, a death by lightning. As the Nautilus pitched violently, its steel spur rose into the air, seemingly acting as a lightning rod. I saw long sparks erupt from it. Overwhelmed and exhausted, I crawled to the hatch, opened it, and descended into the saloon. The storm was at its peak. It was impossible to stand upright inside the Nautilus. Captain Nemo came down around midnight. I heard the ballast tanks gradually filling, and the Nautilus slowly sank beneath the waves. Through the open windows in the saloon, I saw large fish, panicked, flitting through the water like ghosts. Some were struck down before my very eyes. The Nautilus continued its descent. I thought we would find tranquility at a depth of about 8 fathoms. But no, the upper layers were too turbulent. We had to seek refuge deeper, over 25 fathoms down, in the ocean's abyss. But there, what stillness, what silence, what peace. Who would have guessed that such a hurricane raged on the surface of that very ocean? Chapter 20. From latitude 47 degrees 24 to longitude 17 degrees 28, the storm had driven us eastward once again. Any hope of escaping on the shores of New York or the St. Lawrence River had evaporated. Poor Ned, in despair, had isolated himself, much like Captain Nemo. Conseil and I, however, remained inseparable. I mentioned earlier that the Nautilus had veered eastward. To be more precise, we were heading northeast. For several days, it drifted, sometimes on the surface, sometimes submerged, navigating through the dense fog that sailors dreaded. Fog like this was responsible for countless maritime disasters. Ships crashed onto reefs, the wind masking the sound of breaking waves. Vessels collided despite their warning lights, whistles, and alarms. The seabed in these areas resembled a battlefield, strewn with the ocean's vanquished, some ancient and encrusted, others more recent, their iron frames and copper plating gleaming in the light of our lantern. On May 15th, we found ourselves at the southern edge of the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. These banks are formed by sediment and vast accumulations of organic matter, carried either from the equator by the Gulf Stream or from the North Pole by the countercurrent of cold water that flows along the American coast. Erratic boulders transported by drifting ice also contribute to these formations. Nearby lies a massive underwater graveyard of mollusks where millions perish. The sea isn't particularly deep around Newfoundland, only a few hundred fathoms, but further south, a 500-fathom trench plunges into the abyss. Here, the Gulf Stream widens, losing some of its velocity and warmth, but transforming into a sea in its own right. It was on May 17th, about 500 miles from Heart's Content, at a depth exceeding 1,400 fathoms, that I spotted the transatlantic telegraph cable resting on the ocean floor. Conseil, to whom I hadn't mentioned it, initially mistook it for a colossal sea serpent. I corrected him and, to appease his disappointment, recounted some details about the cable's laying. The first cable was laid in 1857 and 1858, but after transmitting around 400 telegrams, it ceased to function. In 1863, engineers constructed another 2,000 miles long and weighing 4,500 tons, which was loaded onto the Great Eastern. This attempt also failed. On May 25th, the Nautilus, submerged at over 1,918 fathoms, was precisely at the location where the cable had ruptured, dooming the Enterprise. It was 638 miles from the Irish coast. At 2:30 p.m, they discovered that communication with Europe had been severed. The onboard electricians decided to cut the cable before retrieving it, and by 11 p.m, they had recovered the damaged section. They spliced it at another point and resubmerged it. But a few days later, it broke again. This time irretrievably lost in the ocean's depths. The Americans, however, remained undeterred. Cyrus Field, the audacious visionary behind the project, having already invested his entire fortune, initiated a new fundraising effort that was immediately successful. Another cable, built to improved specifications, was manufactured. The bundles of conducting wires were each insulated with gutta percha, then wrapped in hemp padding and encased in a metal sheath. The Great Eastern set sail on July 13, 1866. The operation proceeded smoothly, with one notable exception. Several times while uncoiling the cable, they discovered that nails had been recently hammered into it, clearly with the intention of sabotage. Captain Anderson, along with the officers and engineers, held a council and announced that if the perpetrator was caught on board, they would be thrown overboard without trial. From that point on, the sabotage attempts ceased. On July 23rd, the Great Eastern was within 500 miles of Newfoundland when they received a telegram from Ireland announcing the armistice between Prussia and Austria after the Battle of Königgrätz. On the 27th, amidst heavy fog, they reached Heart's Content. The endeavour was a triumph, and for its inaugural message, young America addressed old Europe with these wise words, so rarely heeded. Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill toward men. I hadn't expected to find the electric cable in its original, factory-fresh condition. The long serpent, now adorned with remnants of shells and bristling with foraminifera, was coated in a thick protective layer that shielded it from burrowing mollusks. It lay undisturbed, sheltered from the ocean's movements, under ideal pressure for transmitting the electric signals that travelled from Europe to America in a mere 0.32 seconds. This cable would likely endure for a very long time, as they had discovered that seawater actually enhanced the gutta-percha insulation. Furthermore, at this carefully chosen depth, the cable was never subjected to pressures that might cause it to snap. The Nautilus tracked the cable to its deepest point, over 2,212 fathoms, where it lay unanchored. We then reached the site of the 1863 cable break. The ocean floor there formed a valley about 100 miles wide, deep enough to accommodate Mont Blanc without its peak breaching the waves. This valley was bordered on the east by a vertical wall over 2,000 yards high. We arrived there on May 28th, and the Nautilus was now only 120 miles from Ireland. Was Captain Nemo planning to land on the British Isles? No. To my surprise, he turned south, once again venturing towards European waters. As we rounded the Emerald Isle, I briefly caught sight of Cape Clear and the lighthouse guiding countless ships leaving Glasgow or Liverpool. A crucial question arose in my mind. Would the Nautilus dare enter the English Channel? Ned Land, who had resurfaced as we neared land, bombarded me with questions. How could I answer? Captain Nemo remained elusive. After offering the Canadian a glimpse of the American coast, was he now going to show me the shores of France? But the Nautilus continued its southward trajectory. On May 30th, it passed Land's End, between the southwestern tip of England and the Scilly Isles, which lay to starboard. To enter the channel, we would have to head due east, but we didn't. Throughout May 31st, the Nautilus traced a series of circles on the water, a behaviour that intrigued me. It seemed to be searching for a specific location, struggling to pinpoint it. At noon, Captain Nemo himself came to operate the ship's log. He didn't speak to me but appeared even more melancholic than usual. What could be troubling him so deeply? Was it the proximity to European shores? Was he reminiscing about his forsaken homeland? If not, what emotions was he grappling with? Remorse? Regret? This question lingered in my mind, and I had a growing premonition that chance would soon unveil the captain's secrets. The next day, June 1st, the Nautilus continued its circular pattern. It was clearly seeking a particular spot in the ocean. Captain Nemo measured the sun's altitude, as he had the day before. The sea was calm, the sky clear. About 8 miles to the east, a large steamship was visible on the horizon. No flag flew from its mast, and I couldn't discern its nationality. Moments before the sun crossed the meridian, Captain Nemo took his sextant and observed with intense focus. The perfectly still water aided the process. The Nautilus was motionless, neither rolling nor pitching. I was on the platform when he took the measurement, and the captain uttered these words. "It is here." He turned and went below. Had he noticed the ship that was altering its course and seemingly approaching us? I couldn't say. I returned to the saloon. The hatches closed, and I heard the hiss of water entering the ballast tanks. The Nautilus began to descend vertically, its propeller idle. A few minutes later, it came to rest on the seabed at a depth of over 420 fathoms. The luminous ceiling dimmed, then the windows opened, and through the glass, I saw the sea brilliantly illuminated by our lantern's beams for at least half a mile around. I looked to port and saw nothing but a vast expanse of tranquil water. But to starboard, on the ocean floor, a large protrusion caught my eye. It resembled a ruin encrusted with white shells, almost like a blanket of snow. Examining it closely, I recognized the familiar shape of a mastless ship, undoubtedly sunken. It clearly belonged to a bygone era. To be so thickly coated in calcium carbonate, this wreck must have spent countless years on the ocean floor. What ship was this? Why had the Nautilus visited its grave? Could it be anything other than a shipwreck that had drawn us here? I was lost in thought when I heard Captain Nemo's voice, low and measured, beside me. Once, this ship was called the Marseillaise. It carried 74 guns and was launched in 1762. In 1778, on August 13th, commanded by La Poitre-Vertrieux, it valiantly fought against the Preston. In 1779, on July 4th, it participated in the capture of Grenada with Admiral d'Estaing's squadron. In 1781, on September 5th, it took part in the Battle of the Chesapeake under the Comte de Grasse. In 1794, the French Republic renamed it. On April 16th of that same year, it joined Villeray-Joyeuse's squadron at Brest, tasked with escorting a grain convoy from America under the command of Admiral Van Stabel. On the 11th and 12th of Prairial in the second year, this squadron encountered a British fleet. Sir, today is the 13th of Prairial, June 1st, 1868. It is now 74 years ago, to the day, on this very spot, at latitude 47 degrees 24, longitude 17 degrees 28, that this ship, after fighting heroically, losing its 3 masts, taking on water, and with a third of its crew incapacitated, chose to sink with its 356 sailors rather than surrender. Nailing its colours to the mast, it vanished beneath the waves to the cry of "Long live the Republic." "The Avenger," I exclaimed. "Yes, sir, the Avenger. A fitting name," Captain Nemo murmured, his arms folded. Chapter 21. A hecatomb. The name alone sent a shiver down my spine. I knew its tragic history. The Avenger, a French frigate, had indeed sunk in these very waters after a fierce battle against the British. But how had Captain Nemo discovered its final resting place? How had he pinpointed the exact coordinates of its sinking after 74 years? A chilling thought crossed my mind. Had he witnessed the Avenger's demise firsthand? Had he been among its crew? As if reading my thoughts, Captain Nemo spoke, his voice tinged with a profound sadness I had never heard before. "Yes, Professor, the Avenger. I was its captain." The revelation stunned me into silence. It explained so much about the enigmatic man, his bitterness towards the surface world, his self-imposed exile in the depths. I finally understood the source of his immense sorrow, the spectre that haunted him, even in the sanctuary of the Nautilus. "For years," he continued, "I searched for the Avenger, determined to give my fallen comrades a proper burial, a final resting place where they could be remembered and honoured. And now, I have found it." He gestured towards the ghostly outline of the sunken frigate, illuminated by the Nautilus's powerful lights. It was a poignant sight, a silent testament to the courage and sacrifice of those who had perished. "But my quest for vengeance is not yet complete," Captain Nemo said, his voice hardening. "The oppressors who sent the Avenger and its crew to their watery grave must pay for their crimes, and the Nautilus will be their instrument of retribution." His words sent a chill through me. I realized that beneath his scientific curiosity and love for the sea, a burning anger still smoldered. The Nautilus was more than just a vessel of exploration. It was also a weapon, wielded by a man driven by a thirst for justice, or perhaps revenge. "Come, Professor," Captain Nemo said, breaking the silence. "Let's pay our respects to the fallen." We exited the saloon and made our way to the airlock. The crew was already assembled, each man carrying a wreath of seaweed and coral. Ned Land and Conseil joined us, their faces reflecting the solemnity of the occasion. The Nautilus's exterior lights cast an eerie glow on the ocean floor as we stepped out onto the seabed. The water was clear and still. The temperature surprisingly mild thanks to the Gulf Stream. We slowly walked towards the Avenger, its form gradually becoming more distinct as we approached. The frigate lay on its side, its hull partially buried in the sand. Its once proud masts were broken and scattered, its cannons encrusted with barnacles and coral. Schools of fish darted in and out of its gaping wounds, their iridescent scales flashing in the artificial light. Captain Nemo led us to the stern, where the French flag, tattered but still recognizable, fluttered defiantly in the current. He knelt before it, his head bowed in silent prayer. The rest of us followed suit, each lost in our thoughts. After a few moments, the captain rose and addressed the crew. "My friends," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "today we honor the memory of the brave men who gave their lives for their country. They may rest in peace, knowing that their sacrifice was not in vain. The Avenger will be avenged." He then placed his wreath at the base of the flagpole, his gesture mirrored by the rest of us. As we stood there, a school of dolphins swam by, their playful clicks and whistles providing a stark contrast to the somber scene. We returned to the Nautilus in silence. The airlock closed behind us, sealing us off from the watery grave of the Avenger and its crew. As we made our way back to the saloon, I couldn't help but wonder about the future. What other secrets did Captain Nemo harbor? What other battles did he intend to fight? And what fate awaited us, his unwilling passengers, caught in the crossfire of his personal war? As we settled back into the familiar routine of the Nautilus, a sense of unease lingered. Captain Nemo's revelation had cast a long shadow over our journey. The spectre of the Avenger and its tragic fate served as a constant reminder of the darkness lurking beneath the captain's calm exterior. The Nautilus continued its northward course, the hum of the engines a steady backdrop to our unspoken anxieties. Ned Land grew more restless with each passing day, his frustration palpable. He paced the corridors, muttering under his breath, his eyes filled with a desperate longing for freedom. Conseil, ever the optimist, tried to lighten the mood, but even his cheerful chatter couldn't dispel the gloom that had settled over us. I found myself spending more time alone, lost in my thoughts, trying to reconcile the captain's brilliance and compassion with his relentless pursuit of vengeance. One evening, as I sat in the saloon, staring out at the endless expanse of the ocean, Captain Nemo unexpectedly joined me. He seemed to have regained some of his composure, but his eyes still held a trace of sadness. "Professor Aronnax," he said, breaking the silence, "I apologize for my outburst the other day. I allowed my emotions to get the better of me." "I understand, Captain," I replied. "The loss of your crewmates must have been devastating." "Indeed," he sighed. "They were more than just crew. They were my family, my brothers in arms. Their deaths weigh heavily on my conscience." He paused, his gaze drifting towards the window. "But their sacrifice will not be forgotten. The Nautilus will continue its mission, and justice will be served." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken promises. I didn't know what to say. I could only hope that his quest for vengeance wouldn't lead us all to ruin. The following days passed in a tense calm. The Nautilus navigated the Atlantic, its course unwavering. Ned Land's escape plans were put on hold, the stormy weather making any attempt futile. We all waited, each in our own way, for the inevitable confrontation that loomed on the horizon. And then, one morning, it happened. We were cruising at a moderate depth when the Nautilus suddenly shuddered, its engines grinding to a halt. Alarms blared and the crew scrambled to their stations. Captain Nemo rushed into the saloon, his face grim. "We've been detected," he announced. "A warship is closing in on us." Ned Land's eyes lit up with a flicker of hope. "Could this be our chance?" he whispered to me. I shook my head. "I doubt it. Captain Nemo won't surrender without a fight." The Nautilus shook again, more violently this time. We could hear the muffled boom of distant explosions. The captain turned to his lieutenant. "Prepare for combat," he ordered. "We will not go down without a fight." The crew responded with grim determination. The Nautilus transformed into a war machine, its weapons primed and ready. I watched in horrified fascination as the battle unfolded. The underwater explosions illuminating the darkness like flashes of lightning. The Nautilus fought back with ferocity, its powerful cannons unleashing a barrage of destruction. But the enemy ship was relentless, its depth charges relentlessly pounding our hull. The Nautilus creaked and groaned under the onslaught, its once impenetrable armor beginning to buckle. Water started seeping into the saloon, and the lights flickered ominously. The end seemed near. I looked at Ned Land and Conseil, their faces pale but resolute. We had come this far together, and we would face our fate together. Just when all hope seemed lost, Captain Nemo made a daring move. He ordered the Nautilus to surface, its hull breaching the waves like a wounded leviathan. The enemy ship, caught off guard, opened fire, but its shells harmlessly ricocheted off our reinforced plating. The Nautilus retaliated, its cannons roaring, its steel spur tearing into the enemy's hull. The warship listed heavily, its crew scrambling to abandon ship. Within minutes, it sank beneath the waves, its screams and cries swallowed by the ocean's depths. The Nautilus, battered but victorious, slowly descended back into the depths. Captain Nemo stood on the platform, his silhouette outlined against the setting sun. He had won this battle, but at what cost? How many more lives would be lost in his relentless pursuit of vengeance? As I watched him, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pity for the man. He was a prisoner of his own past, trapped in an endless cycle of violence and retribution. The Nautilus, his sanctuary and his weapon, was also his cage, isolating him from the world he both loved and despised. Chapter 22. The last words of Captain Nemo. The hatches sealed us off from that horrific scene, but the saloon remained shrouded in darkness and silence. The Nautilus, 100 feet beneath the surface, was fleeing that desolate place at incredible speed. Where was it headed? North or south? Where was the man escaping to after such a devastating act of retribution? I had returned to my room, where Ned and Conseil sat in stunned silence. An overwhelming sense of dread washed over me as I thought of Captain Nemo. Whatever he had endured at the hands of those men, he had no right to inflict such punishment. He had made me, if not an accomplice, then at least a witness to his vengeance. At 11, the electric lights flickered back on. I went to the saloon. It was empty. I checked the various instruments. The Nautilus was racing northward at 25 miles an hour, sometimes surfaced, sometimes 30 feet below. Consulting the chart, I saw we were passing the mouth of the English Channel, our course propelling us towards the northern seas at a terrifying speed. We had traversed 200 leagues of the Atlantic that night. Darkness enveloped the sea as shadows lengthened, till the moon's ascent. I retreated to my room, but couldn't sleep. Nightmares plagued me. The gruesome scene of destruction replayed endlessly before my eyes. From that day forward, who could predict where in the North Atlantic basin the Nautilus would take us? It maintained its inexplicable speed, shrouded in the northern mists. Would we reach Spitsbergen or the shores of Novaya Zemlya? Would we explore those uncharted waters, the White Sea, the Kara Sea, the Gulf of Ob, the Likovsky Islands, and the mysterious Asian coast? I had no answers. I could no longer gauge the passage of time. The clocks on board had been stopped. It felt like we were in the polar regions, where day and night no longer followed their natural rhythm. I felt myself drawn into that eerie realm where Edgar Allan Poe's tormented imagination once roamed. Like the fictional Arthur Gordon Pym, I half expected to see at any moment that shrouded human figure, vastly larger than any dweller on Earth, cast across the cataract that guards the approach to the pole. I estimated, though I could be wrong, that this perilous voyage of the Nautilus had lasted 15 or 20 days, and I have no idea how much longer it might have continued had it not been for the catastrophe that brought our journey to an end. Captain Nemo was nowhere to be seen, nor was his second in command. Not a single crew member was visible. The Nautilus remained almost constantly submerged. When we surfaced for air, the hatches opened and closed automatically. There were no new markings on the map. I was lost, adrift in a sea of uncertainty. The Canadian, too, his strength and patience exhausted, had withdrawn. Conseil couldn't get a word out of him. Fearing that in a fit of desperation he might harm himself, Conseil watched over him with unwavering devotion. One morning, I couldn't say what date it was, I had fallen into a heavy slumber in the early hours, a sleep both troubled and unsettling. I suddenly awoke to find Ned Land leaning over me, whispering urgently, "We're escaping." I sat up. "When?" I asked. "Tonight. All surveillance on board the Nautilus seems to have ceased. Everyone appears to be in a daze. Will you be ready, sir?" "Yes." "But where are we?" "Within sight of land. I took a reading this morning in the fog, 20 miles to the east." "What land is it?" "I don't know, but whatever it is, we'll seek refuge there." "Yes, Ned, yes, we'll escape tonight, even if the sea swallows us whole. The sea is rough, the wind fierce, but 20 miles in the Nautilus's small boat doesn't scare me. I've managed to gather some food and water without the crew's knowledge. I'll go with you." "But," the Canadian continued, "if I'm caught, I'll fight back. I'll force them to kill me." "We'll die together, my friend." My mind was made up. The Canadian left. I went to the platform, struggling to keep my balance against the onslaught of the waves. The sky was menacing, but with land somewhere in those dark shadows, we had to make our escape. I returned to the saloon, both dreading and hoping to encounter Captain Nemo, wanting and yet not wanting to see him. What could I possibly say to him? Could I conceal the instinctive horror he evoked in me? No. It was better not to face him. Better to forget him. And yet, that day, the last I would spend on the Nautilus, seemed interminable. I remained alone. Ned Land and Conseil avoided conversation, afraid of revealing their plan. I ate dinner at 6, but I wasn't hungry. I forced myself to eat despite my revulsion, knowing I needed my strength. At 6:30, Ned Land came to my room. "We won't see each other again before we leave," he said. "The moon won't be up at 10. We'll take advantage of the darkness. Meet us at the boat. Conseil and I will be waiting." The Canadian left without giving me a chance to respond. Wanting to confirm the Nautilus's course, I went to the saloon. We were traveling north-northeast at a frightening speed, more than 50 yards below the surface. I took one last look at the natural wonders, the artistic treasures amassed in this underwater museum, this unparalleled collection destined to perish at the bottom of the sea along with its creator. I wanted to etch it into my memory forever. I lingered for an hour, bathed in the glow of the luminous ceiling, my eyes sweeping over the treasures displayed behind their glass cases. Then I returned to my room. I changed into sturdy seafaring clothes and gathered my notes, securing them carefully. My heart hammered in my chest. I couldn't control its frantic rhythm. My anxiety and agitation would surely give me away if Captain Nemo saw me. What was he doing at this moment? I pressed my ear against his door. I heard footsteps. He was there, awake. With every passing second, I expected him to appear and demand to know why I was trying to escape. I was constantly on edge. My imagination ran wild. The tension became so unbearable that I considered going to his room, confronting him face to face, defying him with my gaze and my stance. It was a mad impulse, and thankfully, I resisted it. I lay down on my bed, trying to calm my racing heart. My nerves settled somewhat, but my agitated mind replayed my entire existence aboard the Nautilus. Every incident, joyful or tragic, that had transpired since my disappearance from the Abraham Lincoln, the underwater hunt, the Torres Strait, the Papuan natives, the stranding, the coral cemetery, passage through the Suez Canal, the island of Santorini, the Cretan diver, Vigo Bay, Atlantis, the iceberg, the South Pole, the icy entrapment, the The battle with the squid, the storm in the Gulf Stream, the Avenger, and the horrific image of the ship sinking with all its crew. These events flashed before my eyes like scenes from a play. Captain Nemo's image seemed to loom larger, his features taking on superhuman proportions. He was no longer my equal, but a creature of the deep, a sea-dwelling demigod. It was now 9:30. I cradled my head in my hands, trying to prevent it from exploding. I closed my eyes, refusing to think anymore. There was another half hour to endure, 30 minutes of a living nightmare that threatened to drive me insane. Then, I heard the distant strains of the organ, a melancholy melody accompanying an enigmatic chant, the lament of a soul yearning to break free from its earthly shackles. I listened intently, barely breathing, immersed, like Captain Nemo, in the musical trance that was pulling him towards the precipice of existence. A sudden thought filled me with terror. Captain Nemo had left his room. He was in the saloon, which I had to cross to escape. I would encounter him there one last time. He would see me, perhaps even speak to me. A single gesture from him could destroy me. A single word could chain me to the Nautilus forever. But it was almost 10. The time had come to leave my room and join my companions. I couldn't hesitate, even if Captain Nemo himself materialized before me. I cautiously opened my door, and even then, as it swung on its hinges, it seemed to make an ear-splitting noise. Perhaps it was just my overwrought imagination. Crept down the Nautilus's darkened stairs, pausing at each step to quell my pounding heart. I reached the saloon door and opened it slowly. The room was cloaked in darkness. The organ's music drifted faintly. Captain Nemo was there. He didn't see me. Even in full light, I doubt he would have noticed me, so completely was he absorbed in his melancholic reverie. I tiptoed across the carpet, avoiding any sound that might betray my presence. It took me at least 5 minutes to reach the door on the opposite side, leading to the library. I was about to open it when a sigh from Captain Nemo froze me in place. I knew he was getting up. I could even see him as light from the library spilled into the saloon. He moved towards me silently, arms crossed, gliding like a phantom rather than walking. His chest heaved with sobs, and I heard him murmur these words, the last I would ever hear from him. Almighty God, enough, enough. Was this a confession of remorse, escaping from the depths of his conscience? In desperation, I bolted through the library, raced up the central staircase, and taking the upper level, reached the dinghy. I scrambled through the opening where my two companions were already waiting. Let's go, I urged. Right away, the Canadian replied. We quickly secured the hatch on the Nautilus's hull using a skeleton key Ned Land had procured. The dinghy's opening was also sealed. The Canadians started loosening the bolts that still tethered us to the submarine. Suddenly, a commotion erupted. Voices shouted back and forth. What was happening? Had they discovered our escape? I felt Ned Land slip a dagger into my hand. Yes, I murmured. We know how to die. The Canadian paused his work. But a single word, repeated over and over, a terrifying word, revealed the source of the turmoil on board the Nautilus. It wasn't us they were worried about. The maelstrom, the maelstrom. Could a more dreadful word in a more dreadful situation have reached our ears? We were off the treacherous coast of Norway. Was the Nautilus being pulled into that abyss just as our boat was about to break free? We knew that at high tide, the confined waters between the Faroe and Lofoten Islands surged with unstoppable force, creating a vortex from which no ship ever escaped. From all directions, colossal waves converged, forming a chasm aptly named the Navel of the Ocean, its pull extending for 12 miles. There, not only ships, but even whales and polar bears from the northern regions met their end. It was there that the Nautilus, whether by intention or accident, had been steered by the captain. It was caught in a spiral, its circumference shrinking relentlessly. The dinghy, still attached to its side, was dragged along at a dizzying speed. I felt that sickening vertigo that comes from prolonged spinning. We were paralyzed with fear. Our terror reached its peak. Our blood ran cold. our nerves numb, and we were drenched in a cold sweat. The sweat of impending doom. And the noise surrounding our fragile vessel, the deafening roars echoed for miles, the tumultuous uproar of water crashing against the jagged rocks below, where even the sturdiest objects were pulverized and trees were stripped bare, with all the bark rubbed off, as the Norwegians say. What a predicament. We were tossed about mercilessly. The Nautilus fought back like a living creature. Its steel frame groaned and strained. At times, it seemed to stand upright, and we with it. "We have to hang on," Ned shouted, "and secure the bolts. We might still be saved if we stay with the Nautilus." He hadn't finished speaking when we heard a shattering sound. The bolts snapped, and the dinghy, torn from its moorings, was hurled like a stone from a slingshot into the heart of the maelstrom. My head slammed against something metal, and the violent impact knocked me unconscious. Chapter 23, Conclusion. And so concludes the voyage beneath the seas. What transpired that night, how the dinghy escaped the maelstrom's vortex, how Ned Land, Conseil, and I survived that hellish abyss, I cannot say. But when I regained consciousness, I found myself lying in a fisherman's hut on the Lofoten Islands. My two companions, safe and sound, were beside me, holding my hands. We embraced, overwhelmed with relief and gratitude. At that moment, returning to France seemed impossible. Travel connections between northern and southern Norway were scarce, so I'm compelled to wait for the monthly steamer departing from North Cape. Here, among the kind people who have welcomed us, I am once again revising my account of these adventures. Not a single fact has been omitted, nor a detail exaggerated. This is a faithful record of an extraordinary journey into a realm inaccessible to most, but one that progress will inevitably conquer. Will I be believed? I don't know. And ultimately, it hardly matters. What I can assert with certainty is that I have earned the right to speak of these seas, having traversed 20,000 leagues beneath them in less than 10 months, on a submarine circumnavigation that has revealed countless wonders. But what has become of the Nautilus? Did it withstand the maelstrom's fury? Is Captain Nemo still alive? Does he continue his terrifying acts of vengeance beneath the ocean's surface? Or did he finally find peace after that last massacre? Will the waves one day deliver to him this manuscript, the chronicle of his life? Will I ever learn his true name? Will the fate of his vanished vessel reveal his nationality? I can only hope. And I also hope that his remarkable craft triumphed over the sea's most treacherous abyss, that the Nautilus has endured where so many others have perished. If that is the case, if Captain Nemo still resides in the ocean, his chosen home, may the rage in his tormented heart subside. May the contemplation of such boundless wonders extinguish his spirit of vengeance forever. May the avenger fade away, leaving only the philosopher to continue his peaceful exploration of the sea. If his destiny is extraordinary, it is also sublime. Haven't I experienced it myself? Haven't I lived 10 months of this unnatural life? And to the question posed by Ecclesiastes 3,000 years ago, who can fathom the depths? Only two men alive today can provide an answer: Captain Nemo and myself.
We hope you have enjoyed this episode of Quantum Dispatches, and stay tuned next week for another thrilling adventure. Thank you for listening.